Chapter 227. It turned out that regardless of whether a person could swim or not, they all wished they could have a boat after falling into the water, even if it was just a small dinghy. For example, like the Zhang Yuan. On the second day after being swept away by the offshore current, Key's boat had already carried 7 people. It was already full and almost overloaded, considering that there were 2 extremely sturdy polar bear men and 3 even taller hunchback men among them. The hunchback men were a bit taller. As the captain, the young blue dragon had to pick up the broken trees that were swept into the sea with the help of the crew member Koss. He peeled off the bark and twisted it into ropes to make outboard brackets with extra floating objects on both sides of the Zhang Yuan. "Boy, this is for you," Fury Bear said to Koss. He climbed up the side of the boat from underwater and threw up a few fish he caught. "Is there any firewood on the boat? If not, you can eat the fish raw after removing the internal organs." Geller, one of the rescued camel men, pulled the chief of the Bearman tribe, and Fury Bear flipped into the cabin of the Zhang Yuan. "Don't start a fire if you can." Gearson handed a water bag to the polar bearman, who went into the sea to catch fish. The bag contained fresh water he made with the elemental shaman's ability. "Maybe the guy who caused the tsunami is looking for us." The other 2 rescued people, Wolfgar and Proud Twin Peaks, were now helping to replace the mast of the Zhang Yuan under the command of Keys. The young blue dragon had just picked up a suitable piece of broken wood from the sea. As long as the sail was repaired and the spare sail was raised, the camel shaman guaranteed that he could summon the magic wind and make the trimaran sail faster. "Where are we now?" Fury Bear asked the crew member Koss, who was trying to determine the course while drying his fur. "I mean, which direction is the land?" Although he tried to make himself look kind, his originally ferocious appearance still made Koss a little nervous. "Mr. Fury Bear, I'm not sure yet. I have to find a reference point. For example, there's a sandbar ahead." The little boy looked back and shouted excitedly to Keys. As people who drifted on the sea all year round, even if they didn't encounter shipwrecks every day, it wasn't rare either. Therefore, compared to the hunchback and the polar bear people, they had more experience in dealing with such disasters. There were only 2 places in the island world that were suitable for the reproduction of races. They were occupied by the Camel People Empire and the Polar Bear People Federation. Other than that, there were actually many small islands scattered around. Of course, most of the resources there were not enough to support even a circular base. However, the ancestors of the floating raft people still explored these miniature islands one by one, and they left information on them: the location of food and clean drinking water, the nearby sea routes, the names of the circular bases that they might pass by. They left behind a complete set of information so that in the event of a shipwreck in the future, they could rely on this information to find a way to survive if their fellow clansmen were stranded here. Day after day, year after year, on almost every lone island in the island world, the people on the floating raft had left behind rescue information that had been updated over the generations. However, this information was written using ancient human symbols. Even if other races occasionally found these symbols when they landed, they would mistake them for the special texture of the rocks. And Koss, who grew up in the circular base, could naturally read those symbols. He was very excited when he saw the sandbar. The repaired mast was hung with a spare sail. Gearsan personally summoned the magic wind to drive it. Coupled with the temporary hydrofoil that Keys had added to the Zhang Yuan, the trimaran galloped on the sea. After a while, they were close to the shore of the sandbar. This sandbar doesn't look small. As they were close to the shore, there was no need to take care of the sail. Keys stood on the bow and commanded the cheap passengers on the ship to pull the Zhang Yuan onto the beach while looking at the land in front of him. You can say that it's a small island. At first, they thought that it was just a sandbar in the sea. There were a few grassy dunes in the middle, and at most 1 or 2 slightly salty springs. But who would have thought that when they got closer, they found that it was far from it? Have you found a rock beacon that recorded the information? Keys approached a rock where Koss was looking around. "What did you find?" The little boy scratched his head in confusion and pointed to a few obvious scratches on the rock wall. "It's a bit strange here. There should be information about our location, but it's scraped clean." He continued to explain. Instead, it points out that if we sail east for 2 days, we can reach another sandbar, and how to get some food and water nearby. This is because they don't want others to know where this is. Koss thought for a moment and came up with a possible answer. It's even better not to stay here. This means someone lives here and doesn't want to be disturbed. Keys agreed with his idea. Based on your experience, where should we be now? We've been drifting for less than 2 days. It stands to reason that we shouldn't be too far away from the Camel Empire. Koss squatted down and groped in a grass nest for a while. He took out a few wild onions. Yes, this wild onion is a specialty near this island chain. There's a relevant record in the logbook of the circular base. I remember it clearly. That circular base, the one that sent people to assassinate the polar bearman's diplomatic mission. Have you been in contact with it before? Keys suddenly thought of a possibility, so he asked Koss. And the time of landing of the 2 circular bases isn't a little too close? No, I've never seen that base before. And the little boy recalled the details of the night before. Some of those people were wearing clothes made of seal skin, which is a specialty of thick, sturdy island. Most of them were sold by walrus merchants in the Federation. If they had traded there more often, it stands to reason that their circular base should be built with fir wood. But according to my observation, the main material of the circular base was bamboo. This is a kind of wood that can only be produced in the small islands near the Camel Empire. The long-gilled rafters. Obviously, there was an advanced intelligence to assassinate the polar bearman's diplomatic mission. The 2-humped camel noble, who was both a priest and an elemental shaman. The landing of the demonic fish on the beach, not far from the Camel Empire, on a miniature island that clearly displayed as strangers are not allowed to enter posture at first glance. The strange information that seemed to have no connection was instantly connected. Keys suddenly understood. He had a vague but reasonable guess about this series of events. First of all, the assassination at the trading market was obviously for the purpose of sending people to their deaths. In other words, someone knew the whereabouts of the polar bearman's diplomatic mission and could send the long-gilled rafters to their deaths. If he listened to the dead captive, then the mastermind behind the scenes was the demonic fish or even the Council of 7 Gills. This could be linked to the subsequent monster attack and the tsunami caused by the demonic fish. However, if he thought about it carefully, although this reasoning was logically sound, there were problems with the details. First, if the demonic fish really wanted to kill an important person in the polar bearman's diplomatic mission, then they could have sent more elite assassins to directly carry out the assassination. There was no need to play hard to get and lure them to the beach. Second, to be able to arrive at the trading market in such a short period of time, the place where the long-gilled rafters lived was probably not too far from the Empire's borders. The strangers are not allowed to approach. Island that Keys and company had landed on was very suspicious. Third, even if the Empire's control over the sea was very weak, there were a large number of long-gilled rafters living in this sea area that was close to the Camel's forces. There was definitely a higher-up of the Camel people who knew about their situation. Therefore, the young blue dragon came to a more reasonable guess. Those long-gilled rafters might not have been ordered by the demonic fish. The demonic fish that was powerful enough to cause a tsunami might only be a participant in the entire matter, or even a tool. The real mastermind behind the scenes was hidden in the higher-ups of the Camel Empire. They planned this matter to catch the polar bearman's diplomatic mission, some camel people in the trading market, and the extra rafters in one fell swoop. This also explained why the demonic fish appeared. This conspiracy would kill some important figures in the island world's Camel Empire and the Polar Bearman Federation at the same time. It was completely possible that it would cause unrest among the land races. Therefore, they were happy to take action and help. It had to be said that the brain was a good thing, and the intelligence of Megalosaurus was generally not low. Except for the details of using the reader's letter to catch the big fish, Topulo, Keys's guess almost restored the facts of the entire matter. Then, what's the identity of the higher-ups of the camel people? The young blue dragon held his chin and thought. To be able to make the demonic fish appear in this matter, it shouldn't be their spy. Keys was able to come to this more advanced conclusion thanks to his previous trip to the lower plane. As a commander on the demon's side, he learned the advanced way of thinking about the motive of motive from the Bator race. If the mastermind of this matter was sent by the demonic fish to the higher-ups of the Camel Empire like the shape-shifting monster he had encountered before, then there was a high probability that the demonic fish would not appear in this matter. Because in that case, while causing unrest among the land races, it was very likely to arouse their common hatred for a common enemy. After eliminating the possibility of the demonic fish being a spy, the question of who is the mastermind behind this matter could be screened from the perspective of the ultimate beneficiary. Simply put, whoever gained the most would be the biggest suspect. However, due to the interference of the young blue dragon, the fait accompli of the whole matter, the deaths of Wulfgar and Gearsan, did not come to fruition. Therefore, the mastermind might not be able to obtain the final reward that he expected. How should I get share? Keys secretly thought as he looked at the people who were busy on the shore. Soon after, an imperceptible smile appeared on his face. Chapter 228. In the Double Peak Temple, the Hunchback Emperor sat upright with an angry look on his face. However, if someone happened to be standing behind him, they would notice that the twin peaks behind him were trembling slightly. Usually, the emperor would only show this kind of special body language when he was suppressing the extreme joy in his heart. Do you know? The emperor slammed his palms on the gilded armrest of the chair as he stood up and asked sternly, "How important is that polar bearman named Wulfgar? He's the only son of the chief of the polar bearmen, the common ruler of the 31 tribal states of the Federation." In the face of the furious emperor, dozens of Double Peak nobles knelt before the Dan Emperor and trembled in fear. Caesar, a mature Double Peak noble, was the first to break the silence among the courtiers. "What we need now is action, not blame. No one wants that to happen." After seeing the beacon fire, the nearby troops immediately rushed to the headland to reinforce. But who knew? There was a tsunami. The Hunchback Emperor interrupted him rudely. "But if you didn't spend your time on decorating your tattoos with ochre, comparing which food is more suitable for dinner between cheese and braised cod, counting the number of steel coins in the pea-toy jar, all kinds of boring and time-wasting aristocratic family affairs, the distinguished guest from the Federation might have been saved and escaped the disaster. Your Majesty, a single peak hunchback's servant did not use the Caesar that only nobles could address him. Instead, he quickly ran over and whispered beside the emperor, 'The Federation's embassy has received the news. They said, before they get a satisfactory explanation, the tin or trade this year will be temporarily canceled and will be discussed later.' Tin was an important component of bronze. Since they began to study metallurgy, the hunchback's demand for this metal had greatly increased. However, the reserves of tin ore in the empire were very limited. On the contrary, the various mineral resources on Hojian Island were abundant. In the annual official trade between the Federation and the empire, the most important commodity was tin ore. It was a veritable highlight. When the emperor informed the Double Peak nobles present of this news, everyone was in an uproar. They are not the only ones who have suffered casualties. The Twin Peak noble who had just been interrupted was quite experienced. He did not give up expressing his opinion just because of the emperor's taunt. 2 Twin Peak nobles, Gearsan and Proud, along with a whole team of guards, have all disappeared. It is very likely that they have died in battle. Moreover, many merchants in the market can testify that the polar bear men were assassinated by the raft men before they went to the coast. We can give a satisfactory explanation, which is that the raft men and the demonic fish are in cahoots with each other. The Empire and the Federation are both victims. That's not enough. Just like what you said just now, the Emperor said calmly. His emotions did not seem to be as agitated as before. Other than a reasonable but pale explanation, we should take action soon after the monarch and minister's memorial ended. On a craggy cliff somewhere along the coast of the Imperium, a bronze gate slowly opened. A total of 30 Nar-type galleys, which represented the highest shipbuilding level of the Camel people, lined up and sailed out of the secret military port. These large ships made of metal and blackened wood were both sturdy and ferocious. Fir trees were used as the keel. Cut cypress planks were glued together with alchemy glue and then tenon together to form the hull. The seams were filled with pitch and tar. The hull was equipped with bronze spikes, which were specially used to prevent monsters from attaching themselves and climbing up. Each ship was equipped with a spellcaster team made up of several elemental shamans and camel priests. Some summoned magic wind to fill the square sails on the mast and cooperate with the oarsmen to speed up the ship. Some concentrated on boiling potions made from root plants and poured them into the sea, leaving patches of brownish-red stains. When the ships sailed past and the stains dispersed, a large number of corpses of poisoned fish, prawns, and crabs would gradually float on the surface of the sea. It was a ghastly sight. On a nameless island near the sea of the Camel Empire, Keyes, who obtained the last piece of the puzzle from Kos, quickly deduced the truth of the whole matter. At this time, his mind was full of thoughts on how to fish in troubled waters and how to get a share of the loot. "Captain!" Kos's shout came from afar. "There's an abandoned boat in the grass. It seems to be a small boat." Small boat was a term inherited from ancient humans. In the camel people's language, it should be called a cluck boat. It was round and short, with only one sail and one steering oar. It only needed 1 or 2 sailors to operate. When building a cluck boat, the skeleton needed to be made with willow branches first, then soaked in oak bark solution and soaked in lanolin before wrapping it around the skeleton. Finally, the entire hull was sewn together with linen thread and leather strips. The process was very simple. The camel people used to use this kind of boat. Pointing at the moldy hull, the boy explained, "Moreover, this boat looks like it has been abandoned for a long time. The cowhide is moldy, and the oars are broken." Hearing Kos's greeting, several passengers on the Voyager also came over. Gearson saw the cluck boat hidden in the grass, and the old camel also recognized the shape of the boat. "So, we should still be near the Empire." After listening to the boy's explanation, Wolfgar was the first to ask. Knowing that his disappearance might cause diplomatic problems, the son of the polar bear chief was a little anxious. "I'll go find some wet firewood to light the smoke signal. The Empire should have sent a search and rescue fleet to find me us." A broad palm touched his shoulder. Fury Bear could understand Wolfgar's feelings at the moment, but the polar bear chief hoped that the boys who were swept away by the tsunami could be rescued. "Son," Fury Bear said in a low voice, "don't worry. Before you expect help, you must first understand your situation." And he paused. "Maybe we still have a fight to fight." After saying this, the polar bearman, known as Thunder Roar, let out his signature roar. He quickly leaped into the distance where the vegetation was lush. After a few cries of pain and the sound of some wooden poles breaking, Fury Bear stood up again. The rafters with gills. Gearsan immediately noticed the gills on the shoulders when he saw the polar bear carrying a captive with bare shoulders. Cluck boat, near the Empire's coastline, like a thunderbolt across the sky. The camel shaman suddenly thought of something, but there was a flash of doubt in his eyes. The elder finally fell asleep after tossing and turning. The illusion dragged him, oppressed, mocked, and tortured him. The illusion was vague, the scene of peace and prosperity and the image of disaster intertwined in his mind. Their tribe had settled here for more than 30 years. The Camel Empire accepted them and gave them abundant resources that other circular bases had never received. In exchange, their tribe received a secret transformation, and their bodies grew gills that allowed them to breathe underwater. Of course, this was nothing at all. Compared to the harvested resources, the elemental shaman born among the tribe, and the ability to have solid land that other people on the raft had never had, this physical transformation that was beneficial to living on the sea was actually a gift from a certain point of view. But 2 days ago, when the Lord of the Camel Empire directly sent an order, the Elder had an ominous premonition. Originally, it was inconvenient to do some dirty work for the Lord, such as intercepting merchant ships, dealing with exiled political dissidents, and so on. They were all willing to do it. Since they could breathe in the water, it was easy for them to do things. But when the people of the Sky Clan left, he had a trace of hesitation. Night was surrounded by illusions. He stood there with nothing under his feet. There were only stars and the ink-black sky around him. It was the same above and below him. The images of the elemental spirits of fire, earth, air, and water were all angry, sullen, and furious. The water surged and surrounded him. The air turned into a gust of wind that whipped him. The powerful storm lifted the ship and destroyed the 3 circular bases that their tribe had far surpassed their peers. Then came the flames, occasionally struck by lightning. The flames were like birds protecting their nests, pouncing on the houses where the tribe lived. Just as he was about to be killed by the flames in the illusion disappeared. He was safe and sound. His whole body was trembling as he gasped for breath. Time passed by, and nothing happened. However, the illusion continued. For a moment, he felt a rumbling sound under his feet. He knew that the air, water, flames, and earth had already made a painful sound. They had warned him, but he had never paid attention to it before. The creatures in the sea died in batches, and the corpses of various sea creatures floated on the surface of the sea. Without the support of these creatures, the land under their feet could not support his people at all. They would die in the end. "No!" he shouted and sat up straight. He blinked his eyes to adjust to the light from the whale oil candles in the hut. "What's wrong, master?" The young apprentice heard his master shout and walked into the hut. His words were clear and powerful, completely unaffected by the illusions that made the elder uneasy. The elder wanted to open his mouth to answer, but his mind suddenly turned dark, just like the scene in the illusions. He dreamed of something. He had to recall this matter and tell. I don't know," he murmured. "Something terrible is about to happen. The elemental spirits seem to be warning me, and my shaman path is not perfect. I don't know what it is, but we'd better leave here quickly." The young apprentice nodded. "I understand." After saying that, he stabbed a sharp bronze dagger into his master's chin under the elder's surprised gaze. "For his majesty." Chapter 229. After some interrogation, beating, stabbing, and pinning his feet to the ground with wrought tan, Gearson finally got some valuable information from the captive patrol members. This island was located near the southern border of the Camel Empire, and it was less than a day's journey with the wind. The residents of the island were indeed people with long gills. They had 3 circular bases and made a living by fishing and raising seafood. Long gills were a physical feature that was only popularized in the last 20 years. Only a few people grew parotid glands earlier. The leader of the island was an elemental shaman who had close contact with the Empire's top officials and often sent supplies. "Teacher," Proud Twin Peaks turned sideways and whispered beside Gearsan, "Irrelevant people. Let's get rid of them." The young elemental shaman squinted at the young blue dragon and Koss, who were tasting some kind of wild onion. Flames surged in the palm hidden behind his back, and a shaman spell similar to the burning hand had taken shape. "If I were you," a rough voice sounded beside him as Wolfgar walked to the camel with a warhammer, "I would never have such an idea. When you make a move, that person will kill you first." Before Proud Twin Peaks could finish his words, he was interrupted by the polar bear chief's son. "We are not in the same group." He deliberately raised his voice and continued. "In fact, I wanted to visit Mr. Gearsan, but the members of the diplomatic group were involved in the conspiracy." Wolfgar glanced at Gearsan. "Now it seems that my innocent compatriots who died must be related to the internal strife among you camels. You should be responsible for the whole thing." The Twin Peaks aristocrat was just about to refute when Gearsan reached out and grabbed his arm. "Son of the great chief," he pointed out Wolfgar's identity. "I agree with you. I actually have plans to find out the mastermind of this conspiracy." After that, Gearsan turned and walked in the direction of the islanders' gathering place, according to the captive, leaving Proud Twin Peaks in the same place with a gloomy face. "Let's follow them," Wolfgar said to Fury Bear, who had walked to his side. Fury Bear nodded. "You're right. Before we get help, we might have to fight." "Interesting." Chewing on the wild onion and savoring the sweetness amidst the spiciness, the young blue dragon spoke to Koss, who was helping him collect gifts for Blue the Ogre. "Do you want to watch the show? As usual, stay by my side." The island was in the shape of a crescent moon. It was neither big nor small. Following the patrolling path obtained from the captives, the few of them didn't walk for long before they arrived at a settlement that had the typical style of the floating raft people. Two circular bases were anchored in the middle of the bay. Similar to the one they saw earlier, they were mainly made of bamboo and wood. More buildings were scattered along the coastline, and there were signs that the villages were turning into small towns. In the woods far away from the coast, there were pieces of land that had obviously been cultivated for a long time. Many people were working in the fields. Because he was very confident in his combat power, Gearsan did not hide his figure, nor did he ask his companions to do so. The hunchback shaman master waved his hand, and the summoned air elemental carried his message and floated to the settlement of the floating raft people. Since there was an elemental shaman here, he might as well use a shaman's way of greeting. A message that surprised Gearsan came back with the wind. Could it be? How could this be? Logically speaking, if there was an elemental shaman here, even if they were hostile, the elemental spirit would give Gearsan a reply. However, the air elemental brought the message that the elemental spirit was collapsing. Only the elemental spirits of a few apprentices were left here. Woo-woo. The sound of a conch sounded, and the settlement of the floating raft people suddenly became busy. Many young men suddenly dropped their work and ran to a building, and then came out fully armed. Under the leadership of a young man, the militia quickly locked on to the position of Gearsan and the others. After a little assembly, they rushed over. They were armed and angry, and their response was obvious. Avenge the elder. Kill the invaders. Hearing the slogans shouted by the militia as they ran, the son of the polar bear chief was the first to react. Wolfgar picked up his war hammer and said loudly to everyone on his side, seemingly to Fury Bear, "Get ready for battle." Sure enough, there was still a fight. As the militia gradually approached, several of them pursed their lips and made a pow-pow sound. "Captain, be careful." Koss, who was also a member of the floating raft people, immediately reminded Keys. "They have sea dogs." Sea dogs were not fur seals, but a kind of creature that the floating raft people domesticated to help them hunt. They looked like large dogs, amphibious, with web membranes between their toes and a flat tail like a rudder. This kind of creature could run freely on land. They were ferocious and good at besieging. A group of sea dogs could even kill whales. Due to their large appetite, a normal circular base could not afford to feed them. However, the larger circular bases would have people who specially raised them to help the floating raft people hunt or deal with enemies. After receiving the signal from their master, the sea dogs that were lying on the ground immediately launched a fierce attack. However, Keys was quick to react. With a light flick of his spear, he pierced the stomachs of a few beasts and protected Koss. The polar bear people were abnormally strong. Any sea dog that dared to approach would either be hit by Wolfgar's hammer or Fury Bear's palm. Gearsan, who was proficient in the way of the elemental shaman, clapped his hands a few times. The sea dogs that surrounded him heard a burst of sound in their ears. They suddenly fainted and fell to the ground, crying out in pain. Only the young twin peak noble was unlucky. As he lost his weapon in the tsunami, he could only hold a flame in his hand and beat the sea dogs that pounced on him. However, he was still careless. His calf was bitten, and a piece of muscle was torn off by the sea dog's sharp teeth. Teacher, save me." The proud twin peak fell to the ground in pain and shouted loudly. However, Wolfgar, who was closer to him, took the initiative to smash a few sea dogs' heads with his hammer and save his life. Thank you." The pain from the wound made the young hunchback speak in a trembling voice. "Despicable and deformed ants, I will not let any of them go. For the sake of revenge, or rather, to put his words into practice, the proud twin peaks endured the pain of his muscles being torn apart. He chanted the most powerful shaman spell that he could grasp word by word, summoning flames and forming a wall that roasted his flesh. No! Seeing the mutated, floating raft people who rushed to the front, covered in flames and wailing as they rolled down the hill, Gearsan quickly cast a spell to extinguish the wall of flames. "Don't kill them. We have to learn more from them. Girsan stopped talking. Suddenly, a thick fog rose from the sea in the distance and rolled toward the shore. At a speed visible to the naked eye, the thick fog covered the circular base on the shore and the residential area of the mutated floating raft people on the shore. After all, the militia was still the militia. Seeing the strange fog engulfing their town, the young and strong mutated floating raft people immediately rioted. My little Sally is alone at home. My old mother is still washing the yarn net. Worried about their families, many of the militia turned around and left the enemies in front of them to the others. They turned back and ran quickly to the residential area. In order to speed up, some people even threw away their weapons and took off their armor. The elemental shaman apprentice, who took the lead, shouted a few times. Of course, he knew about the thick fog, but there were others working there. And now he needed the help of these militia to stop Girsan and his men and eliminate the hidden danger for His Majesty. Electric sparks flashed in his hands. He wanted to kill a few deserters to stop them from escaping, but who knew that the fog would sweep in so fast that he was also covered by it before the spell was activated. The rumbling of drums came from the thick fog. It's the fleet of the Empire. Girsan immediately recognized the drumbeat. A sharp pain came from the back of his waist. A dagger was deeply inserted into the flesh of the camel shaman. The sound of drums, explosions, and cries from the settlement of the mutated floating raft people sounded one after another, drowning out Girsan's cry of pain. The culprit who stabbed him in the back took advantage of the thick fog to drag his injured leg and quickly fled to the deeper part of the fog. I can't leave now, Proud Twin Peaks thought as he walked. Caesar wants to clean up this group of mutated floating raft people. There must be other elemental shamans here. As long as I can get in touch with them, I will be able to safely withdraw with the evidence of the token. Proud Twin Peaks was not sure if he could kill Girsan with one blow, and because the polar bearman named Fury Bear was also a master of shamanism, Proud Twin Peaks walked very cautiously in the thick fog. From time to time, he would summon small groups of air elements to disturb the fog behind him so that the bloody smell of the wound could quickly dissipate. At the same time, his elemental spirit, which had just been transformed from the elemental essence, was circulating rapidly at the moment, trying to perceive other unfamiliar elemental spirits. Except for Girsan and Fury Bear, the existing elemental spirits on this island must belong to the shamans sent by the Emperor. Relying on this remaining sense of direction, Proud Twin Peaks slowly groped in the thick fog and came to the settlement of the mutated floating raft people. Help! A cry for help came from beside him, but when the person saw his figure clearly, he immediately turned around and ran. Unfortunately, before he could run 2 steps, the man's head was cut off by a sharp halberd. The 32nd one, the single-humped camel warrior said to his companion, as if he was showing off. But immediately, he heard footsteps from Proud Twin Peaks. There's movement over there. Let's go and see. Proud Twin Peaks saw that it was 2 ordinary single-humped camel warriors. Proud Twin Peaks showed a proud expression on his face. We're the shamans. I have something important to tell them. Caesar has personally entrusted this matter to me. There can't be any mistakes. Chapter 230. You have to be responsible for what you say, the commander of the Nair fleet said solemnly as he took the token handed to him by the young Twin Peak noble. Just like we were told before we joined the fleet. As a unit directly under the Emperor, every member of the Nair fleet was required to swear to keep the fleet's secrets. Because of this, the fleet had been quietly developing for decades, but very few people in the Empire knew of its existence. You can check my token. He glanced at the small ceramic bottle in the commander's hand and replied calmly with the same solemn tone. The information inside can prove my identity and the goal of my operation. A camel elemental shaman walked out from the shadow behind Commander Nair, bowed with both hands on his chest, and took the token. One of his palms turned into stone and crushed the ceramic bottle, revealing the inscribed text on the inner wall. Proud, son of Asa Twin Peaks, direct descendant of the 28 pillar nations of the Camel people. Ordered by Caesar, taught by Warlord Gearsan and lurked by his side. At the appropriate time, has the right to eliminate the hidden danger of rebellion. 54555859. 54555859. After reading this message and verifying it with Proud's previous self-description, the commander smiled. You've worked hard and suffered such serious injuries. He walked to the young camel and extended both hands to shake hands. The other party naturally took the initiative to shake hands. Have a safe journey. The young Twin Peak noble was a little stunned by these strange words, but his reaction was still slow. His hands were firmly grasped by the commander. The camel shaman's palms that had turned into stone flashed with electric light and crackled after the stone chips were removed. He closed his 5 fingers, and like a hot knife cutting butter, he reached into Proud's chest and directly pulled out the young Twin Peak noble's burning heart. 54, 55 to 58, 59, the password means eliminate hidden danger. As if out of the last bit of mercy to the younger Twin Peak noble, the commander explained to Proud at the last moment before his death. Of course, this was only the last bit of mercy. After completing the task of eliminating hidden dangers, the camel elemental shaman summoned a ball of flame and turned the residents of the Proud Twin Peaks and the mutated raft people into ashes. Sir, a captain of the Nair Fleet's Marine Corps ran over. We've finished searching this area, but the total number of people reported by each team is inconsistent with the number you provided. There's at least a gap of 1/3. The commander made a prompt decision and ordered, summon the elemental shamans to dispel the fog, and don't let the priests land for the time being. He thought for a moment. Warlord Gearsan may not be dead yet. In addition to being an elemental shaman, he is also a camel priest. It's best to confirm first. I'll take someone to confirm it. The camel shaman hiding in the shadow volunteered. According to the information brought by Proud Twin Peaks, even if Gearsan had been killed, there was still thunder roaring of the polar bear men. He was the only one who could ensure that nothing would go wrong. If necessary, I'll let the traitor die again. The commander nodded, tacitly agreeing with the camel shaman's words. He then allocated manpower, 2 teams of fully armed Marines and 5 other elemental shamans. After dealing with the work here, he left with the rest of the people. In addition to cleaning up the island, the commander's orders also included recovering some things. Under the joint casting of the elemental shamans, the thick fog that shrouded the entire island gradually receded. The corpses of the mutated raft people with long cheeks had been gathered, dragged into the buildings, and poured with kerosene to clean them up. The air was filled with a salty and slightly bloody smell. Coupled with the black smoke produced by the burning of the buildings, the combination of the two covered everyone's mood with a layer of filth. Even if they were just intoxicated with the pleasure of killing, when the tragedy of the massacre was really revealed, the well-trained camel warriors of the Nair Fleet felt an indescribable sense of oppression and discomfort. After all, they were not the demons of the lower realm. No one was born to be an executioner. The tragic scene in front of them made every camel feel a little distressed and somewhat empathetic. A low building stood in the smoke and dust. Although it was located in the center of the mutated raft people's settlement and was faintly complemented by other buildings, there was nothing conspicuous about it. The outer wall was covered with mud wrapped in grass and trees, and layers of palm leaves were laid as the roof. The door of this building was quite unique. Not only were the blind corners wrapped in metal, but there were even dozens of bronze nails embedded on the door as decoration. Open the door. The commander of the Nair Fleet said a long line of words from his mouth. It was different from the language the camel people were familiar with, but it expressed his intention. He activated the password. The additional spell came into effect, and the wooden door opened. After entering, bring back the stolen treasure. Remember, listen to my command. Behind the wooden door, or in this small house, there was an entrance to the crypt and a long staircase hidden. With the commander as the head, a whole team of 30 camel warriors filed in. The stairs were a little steep and slippery, and it was a little difficult to go down. But the height of the passage was high enough. At least with the height of the single-humped camel, They could walk smoothly as long as they lowered their heads slightly. Every time they went down a flight of stairs, the commander would order people to light the whale oil lamps in the alcoves of the passage, so they did not have to worry about walking in the dark. After walking for about 1/10 of an hourglass, these camel people finally stepped on the flat ground. The commander rubbed the ground with his hand, took a torch, and inserted it into the hole reserved in advance. With a whoosh, a line of fire spread out from the commander's position until the lamps on the surrounding walls and dome were ignited. The underground hall instantly lit up. Pieces of green bricks were paved into the floor, and in the center of the hall was a round table built with pine wood. A lead box was placed on the table. Minerva's skull was placed in the lead box at the moment. Not unlike the camel people and polar bear people, the ancient human kingdoms of the island world also gave birth to various ancestral spirits, primitive gods, due to ancestor worship. After the Great Cataclysm, the human kingdoms were destroyed and the racial inheritance was close to being cut off. Those powerful and weak primitive gods, like their believers, fell into a deep sleep one after another and then died out. But gods were gods after all. Even if they did not even have weak divine power, they would not leave no trace like mortals after they died. For example, this god named Minerva still kept her head after she died. Don't think too much, the commander of the Nair fleet reminded. If it were not for Gearson's special identity, he would have been accompanied by a few camel priests at this time. This strange object is very dangerous. You'd better pray the camel god's prayers in your hearts at all times. Minerva was once a god who wielded the authority of wisdom and thought. The head she left behind had long been crystallized and had lost its self-consciousness. But even so, the remaining divine power could still change the surrounding reality. In fact, after this strange object was obtained by an emperor of the empire, it had been studied by the elemental shamans and priests of the camel people for many years. Now, they had basically determined its only remaining function. Minerva's skull could read the thoughts of mortals, and then use divine power to drive a prayer spell, in a sense, but it could only work on the creatures who gave it the thoughts. Those floating rafters with gills were its products. Because they drifted on the sea all year round, being able to breathe freely in the sea was an ability that the floating rafters hoped to obtain from a survival point of view. With a little guidance on this need, the thoughts would become strong enough, and Minerva's skull would be able to accept them. The physical mutation of the floating rafters would then occur. Through selective breeding, this trait change could be stably inherited. Of course, Minerva's skull could not be used indefinitely. The divine power contained in it would be reduced every time it was used. And similar to the prayer spell, if one did not plan carefully, the more persistent the thought, the more unacceptable the result would be. Once, when experimenting with the function of this strange object, some elemental shamans used strengthening their elemental spirits as a thought to input into Minerva's skull. As a result, his elemental spirit was directly replaced by an earth jinn sultan from an inner elemental plane. Feeling offended, the Earth Jinn aristocrat directly cast a spell and turned the camel shaman into a diamond statue. In the years when the camel people were experimenting with the function of Minerva's skull, similar situations had happened more than once. Later, they gave up on using the camel people as test subjects and switched to other species for experiments. The floating rafters with mutated parotid glands were the product of subsequent experiments. The task of retrieving the strange object should have been carried out by devout priests, but the commander had brought enough manpower. Heterogeneous thoughts would make it difficult for Minerva's skull to accept, and it would not be suddenly activated. At the same time, this strange object was stored in a special lead box, which could also play a certain role in isolation. Be careful, the commander of the Nair fleet reminded himself. He moved the torch near the lead box and repeatedly read the various precautions engraved on it to ensure that there were no mistakes. Handle it gently, don't cast spells nearby, don't open the lid. Just as he was about to put his hands on the buckles on both sides of the lead box, there was a series of plop sounds coming from the crypt hall. The commander turned around abruptly, only to find that the soldiers he brought had all collapsed on the cold floor, and he did not know whether they were dead or alive. Hearing the light footsteps behind him, he immediately pulled out the iron sword at his waist, turned his body sideways, and swung the sword backward. Then, the commander of the fleet found that he was still in the position of turning sideways, fixed in mid-air by a force. "What's this?" After doing all this, Keyes looked at his spoils of war and asked calmly, "What treasure is hidden in this box?" The young blue dragon flicked his finger, and the lid of the lead box was instantly opened. A ripple of golden light suddenly shot out from it and entered the body of Keyes, who was dazzled by the light. Chapter 231. The transformation took place quickly. The divine power contained in Minerva's skull instantly took effect. Due to the young blue dragon's passive self-adaptation ability, this relic of a god was put to the best use. Roar! While the commander of Nar's fleet was dumbfounded, Keyes tilted his head back and opened his mouth to an extent that a real human could not achieve. He let out a strange, wavy roar. This roar hit the eardrums of all the camels in the underground hall. A few warriors who had just recovered from the stunned state were immediately stunned again in the mixed echoes. Stone chips fell from the dome and walls. The camel commander had no time to care about the others. He ran toward the cave stairs. He did not want to use his life to test the sturdiness of this underground building. Keyes tilted his hands back and stirred up a gust of wind in the narrow space. All the camels were pushed to the corner of the wall. "What is he doing?" Commander Nar looked back as he fled in panic. He saw the almost extinguished candles in the niche flickered in the sudden gust of wind, projecting strange, dancing shadows. Behind the young blue dragon's humanoid form, the shadows began to expand and grow, twisting like a living creature. When the shadow rose, its form changed. A pair of huge wings pierced through the shadows and spread out. The area it covered was even larger than the area of the hall. Suddenly, the ground cracked open. Hot steam spread above the crack. In the depths of the crack, the orange-red magma and the liquid flames that fell from the mouth of Keyes' dragon body shone brightly. Flames, lightning, and force fields from all directions all gathered here. Fortunately, the commander of Nar's fleet reacted in time. Otherwise, he would have been buried deep underground by the collapsed stones like his subordinates. After transplanting the heart of the golden dragon and absorbing the scales of the power energy dragon, the young blue dragon's passive self-adaptation ability allowed him to successfully complete the mutation and evolution. However, it was ultimately caused by an external object. The physical changes brought about by the mutation were not perfect. In fact, it was precisely because he was unable to control his own power that the young blue dragon had chosen to take human form. Minerva's skull, on the other hand, made up for the shortcoming of passive adaptability and began to adjust his dragon body from the inside out. His body size, which was already far superior to his peers, grew again. This was the most obvious change brought about by this conditioning. Using a larger body size to accommodate more power, it had to be said that it was very reasonable. Of course, this kind of adjustment would consume an astonishing amount of energy. While Keyes' body and bones were growing, his muscles and muscles were dissolving at an even faster rate. At this moment, the divine power contained in Minerva's skull worked again. The remaining power of Minerva, the ancient human god of the island world, was summoned and nourished Keyes' withered body across the river of time. The power of the gods was to change and reshape reality, but this power was limited by their priesthood and domain. Fortunately, Keyes' passive self-adaptation ability was similar to Minerva's skull and was exceptionally compatible. The 3-in-1 process of evolution, mutation, absorption of divine power, optimization, and adjustment was repeated repeatedly until the young blue dragon's self-reconstruction was almost complete. The divine power in Minerva's skull was also completely exhausted. Not a single cent more, not a single cent less. It was just right. The feeling is just right. Keyes, who had fallen into the underground lava lake through the crack he had torn open, stretched his body. The temperature of the lava could no longer do anything to this megalosaurus. This power is awesome. Thinking about the divine power his body had just devoured, the young blue dragon began to recall the taste of that power. Every cell in his body was jumping with joy, instinctively wanting to roar loudly. However, his IQ was still online, and he did not lose the high ground of rationality. Thinking about the island above his head, he now knew that this island was originally a volcanic island, and experiencing the lava that had begun to surge and tumble under his dragon body as if it could rise at any time, Keys immediately restrained his urge to roar. After all, the only person he knew on the island world, the child named Kas, was still on the island. Moreover, this volcanic island was in a good location, and it was very convenient for the young blue dragon to carry out some of the plans that he had already thought of. Therefore, there was no need to destroy it. Thinking of this, Keys's heart stirred. A force field emanated from his body as if he was waving his arm, suppressing the bubbling lava. Of course, he was very clear about the principle of letting it out is better than blocking it. Following the approximate location in his memory, Keys turned over and dived into the lava lake. He waved his sharp claws and began to dig in a direction with all his might. He estimated in his mind that he had probably reached a suitable position, and then he began to wave his claws upward. Earthwork could be regarded as a blue dragon's talent, so Keys did it very smoothly. Not long after, he used his brute force to dig out an outlet for the magma that was suppressed by the force field. In the process of digging, the passive adaptive ability that had also been optimized quickly came into effect. The young blue dragon's front claws began to gradually grow longer, becoming stronger and sharper, so that he could easily cut through rocks and shatter earth. And when he rushed out and swam in the sea, in order to not be trapped by the solidified lava that met the seawater, Keys' sharp claws shrank back to their normal size. Instead, web membranes grew between his toes, and his tail began to become slightly flattened. The passive adaptive ability seemed to have begun to develop in the direction of active adaptive. The young blue dragon himself also noticed this change and could not help but let out a soft exclamation. Whether it was good or bad, he still had to observe for a while. Not to mention Keys' side, the sudden earthquake, the movement caused by the young blue dragon digging the passage, and the subsequent volcanic eruption on the surface of the sea made everyone on this small island extremely fearful. The commander who escaped from the underground hall had no idea what to do at this time. He knew very well that all of this must have something to do with the monster that appeared underground and destroyed the recovery of Minerva's skull. The island world did not have a megalosaurus before, but he could do nothing about it. After all, no one had warned him that he would encounter such a monster in this mission, so he did not have a coordinated solution in his hands. And with the eruption of the underwater volcano, the Nar warship that was docked outside the bay due to the need to use the catapults to attack the circular base was now in chaos. Some would rather risk being stranded and rush to the small island, wanting to go ashore and seek the protection of the elemental shamans to avoid the threat of the volcano. Some raised their sails and lowered their oars, abandoning their colleagues on the island and wanting to retreat and escape on their own. Sitting on a rock on the hillside, a layer of herbal medicine collected from the bushes was applied to his waist. He chewed it up and made it into a wound medicine. Gearson's gaze moved from the wide gap between the two polar bear men who were confronting an unfamiliar shaman and a large number of camel warriors in front of him to the volcano rising from the sea. At this time, the old camel could not help but think of the prophecy that he had obtained not long ago when he communicated with the elemental command for divination. The earth boils. Only then will the mighty be revealed. The smoke and waves go with the wind. Chapter 232. Santos grabbed a quill, dipped it in ink, and began to write the commercial paper on the papyrus. He sprinkled white chalk powder to absorb the excess ink and left it for a while to wait for the ink to dry. Then, he carefully folded the papyrus into a cylinder and stuffed it into a special lacquer cylinder. He scooped a spoonful of wax with a copper spoon and melted it over the fire. He dripped it onto the seal of the lacquer cylinder and finally stamped it with his own seal. This was a job that the fat merchant had to do nearly 100 times a day recently. He was happy and miserable because of it. The sand rhino caravan had expanded several times. The number of sand rhinos in the caravan still exceeded 500, and the number of people had long exceeded 3,000. Relying on the various space stations specially set up for the Leviathan in the cities in the central and southern regions of Medici, these teams were on the move every day. They were busy transporting the goods unloaded from the space stations to the radiation areas of the space stations. As the boss of the Sand Rhino caravan, Santos no longer followed the caravan. The most important thing for him every day was to collect information on the prices of goods from all over the world and use it as a basis to draft and write various commercial papers. After completing the last agreement that needed to be sent out for the day, Santos stood up and poured himself a cup of jujube. As he sipped, he calculated the expected profits for the day. Since the Leviathan's air transportation route, the Sand Rhino caravan no longer needed to accept long-distance transportation business. Each caravan only needed to be responsible for short-distance transportation of the last pail sand. The speed of the payment had increased, and the number of goods handled had also increased. Naturally, he made a lot of money. However, compared to the profits of that person, Santos was very self-aware. I did not compare. He did not even dare to think about it. He had seen the successive actions of the Man-Eater, the Japanese, and the Obsidian Council. The bloody end of those people was enough for anyone to learn a lesson. Santos was especially satisfied with his position as the manager of the scales of Eternal Order Chamber of Commerce. For such a commercial giant that had already begun to take shape, just being involved in it was already enough to make him, a businessman, feel honored. "Boss!" An attendant knocked on the door. After Santos opened the door, he saw a desert kobold behind him. A messenger from the Dragonborn clan on the Leviathan said that there is something important to inform you. After inviting the desert kobold into the house, the kobold handed Santos a letter. Quickly dispatch the various branches of the Chamber of Commerce to collect papyrus, spices, and various ironwares. The more the better. Store them in the warehouses of the various space stations. In 7 days, when the Leviathan returns from Taka, load them up and bring them back to Nome. There was a secret imprint on the back of the letter that was shining brightly. Santos took out an enchantment scroll that was specially used to identify all kinds of spell insignia. After careful verification, he confirmed that this letter was written by the spell consultant of the Megalosaurus Pasha. Understood, no one dares to disobey. The fat merchant left a blank space at the bottom of the letter and quickly wrote down his reply. After that, he sealed the parchment and used wax that had not yet completely cooled down to drip on the seal, and once again fastened the ring. Greetings to His Excellency Pasha. Santos handed the letter back to the desert kobold and watched the kobold put the letter away before continuing. Please be sure to tell Lord Keys that the materials will be prepared within the stipulated time. Island World, on a nameless island near the Camel Empire. Keys, who had revealed the true form of the Megalosaurus, easily subdued a group of mortals. In front of him, the elemental spirits did not dare to obey the summons of the shamans and become enemies, while the camel warriors did not dare to use their weapons. Only the priests were slightly more troublesome. In order to prevent them from tipping off the gods behind them, Keys had to knock them out one by one. Fortunately, the young blue dragon had the help of professionals. The spirits' extinguishers have been set up. Snader walked into the bamboo house that originally belonged to the mutated Raft Elder. After bowing deeply to his employer in front of him, he said, "The connection between those priests and the camel god they worship has been temporarily blocked." As the steampunk half-lich waved his hand, the undead creature that had been standing behind him stepped forward and bowed to greet the young blue dragon. Green, burning eyes shot out from its eye sockets and illuminated the face that resembled a human but was between reality and illusion. As the robe swayed, the loose and smooth muscles of this spirit extinguisher were revealed. Dark emblems floated around his body, and the characters that did not need to be supported displayed the curse that came from his heart. The spirit's extinguishers were invisible creatures that represented malice in the night. They despised all living creatures and the moonlight that nurtured them. But the real source of their hatred was actually the hatred of those who serve the gods. If possible, the spirit's extinguishers always wanted to kill those high and mighty gods, although it was obvious that this action was not something that these undead creatures with ordinary combat strength could do. However, they had a very special ability. Through a supernatural ability called redemption, they could break the connection between the gods and their followers. This was also an important factor in obtaining the qualifications to pledge loyalty to more powerful undead creatures. The spirit extinguisher, standing in front of Keys, was the leader of the small spirit's extinguishers that Snader had summoned. The half-lich, who had enough knowledge and had recovered his strength to the legendary level, easily gained the allegiance of the spirit's extinguishers. "My lord," the leader of the spirit's extinguishers said respectfully to his master's employer, as Snader had explained to him, "There's a strange thing that I need to report to you." When the spirit's extinguishers used their redemption ability on the priests, they could feel the intensity of the divine grace on each mortal and the firmness of the priest's faith. Usually, the intensity of the divine grace was about the same, or the latter was slightly higher than the former. But when they dealt with an injured priest named Gearsan, they found that the firmness of the hunchback's faith was far less than the intensity of the divine grace on his body. The spirit's extinguishers even had to work together and use multiple redemption to block the connection between the god and Gearsan. Gearsan's faith is not worthy of the divine grace. The leader of the spirit's extinguishers paused and organized his words. "At first, I thought he was a blasphemous priest, but later I found that was not the case. He is not the Son of God. That weak God must have something in mind for taking care of a believer." A strange green light flashed in its eye sockets. It thought of the sacred samurai that it had met when it first submitted to Snader. That person had so much divine grace that it was about to overflow. Several spirits extinguishers could not help but attack Jason. But who would have thought that as soon as the redemption was activated, the holy power of the sacred samurai, which was always looking after the sacred samurai, annihilated them into nothingness. Of course, the so-called hunchback god could not be compared with the great original law of the multiverse. Using multiple redemption on Gearsan could still cut off the practice between him and the god, but the degree of attention was very much the same. He must be hoping to get something from the hunchback named Gearsan. Spirits extinguishers, who had never been afraid to speculate about the god with the greatest malice, said firmly. Sure enough, the series of encounters when he disguised himself as the people on the floating raft made Keys have doubts about the identity of Gearsan. As an elemental shaman, and favored by the hunchback god, the hunchback emperor wanted to get rid of him quickly. Interesting, the young blue dragon thought to himself. We should find out the reason. After praising the spirits extinguishers for their serious and responsible work attitude, Keys motioned Snader to bring his men out. "Bring that. Nair, fleet commander here," Keys said to a Dragonborn clan attendant beside him. "By the way, inform Brew to come over and get him ready. Well, let him bring a barbecue grill. Maybe it will come in handy." The ogre gourmet had already set up his favorite cooking utensils in the fire pit by the time the kobold warriors brought the twin-humped camel noble over. The bamboo charcoal was already burning, and everything was ready to go. "Today's apricot scones are very good," Brew said with a gentle smile when he saw the newcomer. "You have a wide variety of fruits here, and I feel that my culinary skills can be fully utilized. This is very good." Looking at the monster sitting cross-legged on the ground in front of him, the hunchback commander could not help but swallow his saliva. Without using the glib tongue, he could not understand a language used by the ogre at all. Of course, even if he could understand, it would not reduce the fear in his heart. The gourmet's gentle smile was very similar to the expression when looking at food. "What do you want me to do?" Looking at Keys sitting on the main seat, fear urged him to speak first. The young blue dragon waved his hand. "Calm down," he replied with slight contempt. "I don't want to kill you, at least not now. Otherwise, you would have turned into ashes, minced meat, or other messy things." A ray of light flashed in Key's eyes, hinting at the passion hidden under his human appearance. On the contrary, I have been observing you, and I am satisfied with the results. Keys motioned the hunchback commander to sit beside the bonfire, beside Brew, and outside the range of the desert kobold spear attack. I hope you can keep it up. What do you want? Keys's consolation seemed to have restored the two-humped hunchback's courage. You have to know that the honor of the two-humped nobles cannot be tarnished. I will not. Bang. Brew raised his hand and pressed the hunchback to the ground. He took out a sharp, wailing harpoon and cut off one of the humps on the hunchback's back. He neatly skewered the hunchback on the barbecue grill. The hunchback commander, who had fainted from the pain, woke up again and saw the huge monster gnawing on a piece of roasted fat. Combined with the pain on his back, he quickly realized what the monster was holding in his hand. Are you sure you still want to scare him? The ogre pursed his lips. He had thought that the humps on the back of the hunchback and the humps of the camel beast tasted similar, but he realized that there was no comparison at all. To be honest, this thing is not that delicious. The hunchback commander did not understand Brew's words. To him, the ogre's disdain sounded more like unsatisfied. Keys secretly gave his partner a calm-down expression, and then said to the hunchback who was shivering on the floor, "Look, the honor of the two-humped nobles no longer exists. If you don't speak properly, you won't be able to become a single-humped hunchback." Soon, the interrogation entered a smooth mode of you ask and I answer. Chapter 233. I see. After interrogating the information he wanted from the commander of the Nair fleet, Keys did the same thing again. He verified the information from the captive elemental shamans and basically confirmed his previous speculation about Gerson's identity. Although he still did not know how the Camel Emperor contacted the demonic fish to help him, the young blue dragon understood a lot about why he deliberately killed Gerson. After all, no ruler would be so generous to let a warlord who once held great power sleep beside the bed. As for why the camel god favored Gerson, it probably had a lot to do with his behavior. Keys had discussed the issue of faith with sacred samurai Jensen before. For a devout believer, faith was not only a spiritual reliance, but also a criterion for his behavior. On the other hand, as far as the gods were concerned, whether the actions of the mortal believers lived up to their ideas was far more important than the prayers and worship of the believers due to spiritual injuries. It also had a greater impact on the gods themselves. As a warlord before, Gerson had many fans among the Twin Peaks nobles. His belief that the camel man should not be content with the status quo. He should be prepared for a rainy day and be ready to wage war against the demonic fish should have been recognized by the gods. From the perspective of Gerson, he was indeed kind and wanted to unite the land races and work for the future of freedom and stability for all people. War was just a means, not an end. However, from the perspective of the gods, his development in the island world had indeed reached a bottleneck. In order to change from a demigod to a weak divine power, war might be the best choice. You may have to thank me. After analyzing all the clues, Keys decided to carry out the original plan. However, I'm afraid it's wishful thinking to want the priesthood in the field of war. I don't know if the field of defeat can help you make a breakthrough. Stepping out of the bamboo house, the young blue dragon looked into the distance. The erupting volcano outside the bay had stopped, and an island formed by solidified magma had taken shape, facing the crescent-shaped island under his feet. The ships of the Camel Empire's Nair fleet, including those that tried to escape when the volcano erupted, were all captured by Keys in his dragon form. They were abandoned on the shoal of the island and placed together with the remains of the two circular bases that had been burned down. During the cleanup mission, the mutant rafters that were missed by the Camel Marines were also found by the Dragonborn warriors who came here through the interdimensional portal. Relying on their keen sense of smell, after the desert kobolds searched the entire island, they finally found the survivors of the rafters with long gills hiding in a half-underwater cave under a cliff not far from their settlement. Kas, who had received the young blue dragon's orders, did not have any rebellious emotions and easily accepted the fact that Keys was a megalosaurus. He was still willing to obey the captain, the strong one. He was now under the protection of the Dragonborn warriors, doing ideological work on the survivors of the mutant rafters who were brought back. "I'm your compatriot," Koss said. "I'm no different from you except that I don't have gills. Not long ago, I lived on a circular base. When I was making a deal with the Camel Empire, I was involved in a conspiracy." He choked a little, adjusted his emotions, and continued, "The conspiracy of the upper echelons of the Camel Empire. Some of you should know a little about it, and you should indeed bear some responsibility for it. Debts always have to be repaid, but the creditors are not the group of camels who took your lives yesterday." "That boy did a good job," Sneyd, who was walking beside Keys, praised. "Empathic bewitchment, encouraging persuasion. Even a drow diplomat can't do more than that." In this regard, the young blue dragon did not comment. He had used a spell to detect the alignment of Koss before, and the result showed that the boy's alignment was yellow with a light green. That meant that he was of the neutral alignment, and even a little kind. Being able to have such eloquence was really a talent in a sense. And after coming into contact with Koss, he had always taken care of Koss in the face of danger. Koss's own charm attribute was not low. Discovering this plane is an opportunity. Walking past the ruins of the floating raft people's settlement, Keys and Sneyd walked to the shallow beach by the sea. But if you want to pick the rich fruit, there will be some risks. The power of the primitive gods is weak, and they don't have a divine kingdom to protect themselves. It's not impossible to succeed in the plan if you are careful. The steampunk-style half-lich obviously understood the young blue dragon's words. In addition, there are demonic fish wandering in the depths of the ocean. Keys nodded and agreed with the spell consultant's judgment. "I have my own plans for the one from the Camel Empire." He pointed to the endless sea. "The demonic fish can't go ashore. The only concern is the monster army under its command, and there are many of them. Numbers are never a problem." The steampunk half-lich was very sensible. When it comes to a large number of troops, the necromancer has never been afraid of anyone. There were many reasons as to why Keys wanted to conquer the island world, or what he wanted from this plane. Compared to the Ash world, gold could be considered cheap. New ingredients that the ogre gourmets liked. Various herbs that the ogre witch doctors could use to make new potions. Various primitive gods who were weak, but had divine powers that were not adulterated. Sometimes, reasons were just excuses. If one was willing to look for them, there would definitely be some. But the most essential reason was that if you fell behind, you would be beaten. This was a true proposition that did not need to be proven false. At first, Keys did not have the intention to use trade to communicate, but the first time he tried to contact, he was involved in a series of conspiracies. Even the ruler of the weak small world could be said to have ulterior motives. Moreover, the young blue dragon still had a bloody battle to fight, and about a quarter of the time limit of the bloody battle holiday had passed. If Keys wanted to return to the bloody battlefield again, he would have more trump cards in his hand. Then, the resources of the island world would be a must for him. Since the idea of taking things slowly had been broken by the ruthless reality, he could only start another business and switch back to the way the five-colored Megalosaurus did things. Rob first as a form of respect, and then talk about other things later. Of course, Keys did not want to be the enemy of the whole world and start a full-scale war. In line with the principle of befriend those far away and attack those near, he would use the goods of the scale of perpetual order as a weapon to carry out a gradual commercial plunder. If the cooperation went well, he would even consider some compensation, such as teaching them the skills of metal smelting, helping their civilization to develop to a higher level, and so on. But for the Camel Empire, the relationship with its supreme ruler, the Camel Emperor, was difficult to resolve. Although the news was blocked in a timely manner, the Camel Emperor should not know that the Nair fleet had been completely wiped out. But once the Emperor knew the news, revenge would be his only choice. In fact, the Camel Emperor was like an ant on a hot pan at this time. For any ruler, a fleet was not a chess piece that could be abandoned at any time. According to the arrangement of the cleanup plan, the fleet that should have returned to the secret dock to repair suddenly disappeared. Naturally, The Camel Emperor sent many ships to search for the fleet's whereabouts on the route that they must pass through. But the result was very puzzling. Your Majesty, the valet of the single-humped camel man, brought the latest news. The search fleet is in trouble. According to the report of the elemental shamans, they were attacked by a monster called the Sea House Master during the voyage. Many ships were capsized. Sea House Master? The Sea House Master was a kind of undead creature that lived in the waterways or the waters near the coastal cities. They had a squid-like black body, and in the eyes of ordinary people, they were made of the dark water of the ocean itself. In fact, what made up this monster was the endless fear and despair of those who died at sea. If a ship capsized and the crew drowned, the accumulated resentment and fear before their deaths would combine their souls and become the horrible Sea House Master. Like extinguishing spirit, the Sea House Master was also the work of the half-lich Sneyd, and the raw material he used was the resentful and frightened souls of the innocent victims who drowned in the sea after the Great Tsunami. In a sense, the Sea House Master was sent by its creator to seal off the waters of the Camel Empire to prevent the news about the nameless island from leaking out. It was really an eye for an eye for an eye. So, the Camel Emperor heard that the Sea House Master had appeared, but he calmed down and began to think about the various possibilities behind it. It's not that the demonic fish suddenly returned. The poisonous fish potion that the fleet spread before was not ineffective. He frowned. The Nair fleet may have been attacked by the Sea House Master, and now all of them have been wiped out. No, Your Majesty. The situation was urgent, and the single-humped Camel Emperor's valet did not stick to etiquette. He immediately said, the elemental shamans on the search ship could expel the monster after sacrificing several ships. It doesn't make sense that the shamans on the Nair fleet would be weaker than them. And there's also a problem with the birth of the Sea House Master. According to the estimation of the shamans who fought with it, the Sea House Master is actually relatively weak. That is to say, it was born not long ago. It should have suddenly appeared in the past few days. You mean, the Camel Emperor thought for a while but still had no clue. The seven-beaked council of the demonic fish created a Sea House Master in the past 2 days that was not afraid of the poisonous fish potion and used it to deal with the Empire's fleet? It's possible. After all, the Empire and the Federation don't have the technology to create high-level undead creatures. At least the elemental shamans don't have this ability. The wrong view brought by empiricism gradually led the Camel Emperor's thinking into a dead end. Chapter 234. The magnificent Forbidden Palace stood on the cliff, overlooking the deep and serene Garby Lake, as if it were about to collapse at any moment. When the craftsmen built this magnificent palace, they invited the elemental shamans to help, and their spells fused the stones and the forest into one. 3 spires rose from the center of the palace, made of trees supported by stones. The spires of the spires reached into the clouds, and the windows on the side walls opened slightly. There were elemental shamans and a team of archers in each of the spires, and they could use the spires that reached into the clouds to summon lightning or shoot down from above to attack the invading enemies. The outer walls were made of raised granite blocks, and the inside was filled with clay that had been repeatedly steamed. It was a combination of hardness and softness, and even the bombardment of catapults could hardly do anything to it. The main hall in the center was formed by communicating with the spirits of the wild, gathering more than 100 towering ancient fir trees to support the skeleton of the circular building and covering it with bricks and bronze decorations. Any sane person would be full of praise when they saw this majestic building and would wholeheartedly praise it as a miracle. This palace was called Miniur, which meant Fortress of Arrows, and was the center of Thick Sturdy Island and the Federation. We don't have a choice. Stepping onto the land of Thick Sturdy Island once again, Wulfgar looked at the members of the Dragonborn clan who were swiftly unloading the goods, as well as the 3 ogres who stood not far away. Their physiques were so strong that even he, a polar bear, shuddered in fear. At least before we get home, we don't have a choice. Hearing Wulfgar's words, the chief of the bear clan smiled bitterly and replied, I'm afraid we still have no choice when we return to the fortress of arrows. He saw it more clearly than the young chief's son, Fury Bear. Just like how the Empire relies on tin, or those steel ingots used for trade will definitely put a shackle on the Federation in the future, Fury Bear did not continue. Wolfgar was not as clumsy as he looked, and he should have understood what he wanted to say next. So what if he knew it was a shackle? Whether it was the Megalosaurus that could trigger volcanic eruptions, the floating behemoth that came through the portal made of volcanic rocks, or the Hua whale that escorted them all the way back to thick, sturdy island, all of them left them dumbfounded. The other party was so powerful that even a Pyrrhic victory was an unrealistic hope. Moreover, the Federation was not a monolithic block. While the various tribes of the polar bear men and the walrus men were nominally under the command of the Great Chief, it was hard to say that they would not have other thoughts in the face of the large number of steel ingots delivered by the Great Chief. This was also the reason why Keyes chose to carry out commercial plundering. If it were the Emperor or Caesar alone, the Camel Empire could only resort to force to open its door. The three Ogre brothers were mainly in charge of following the merchant ship to Thick Sturdy Island, but they were not the main docking personnel. In order to facilitate communication, Keyes specially recruited a diplomat in the Ash world. Crying Face, the gladiator star of the Taka City Grand Arena, who could freely switch between the three forms of human, half iron-eating half-human, and half iron-eating half-beast, because of his bestiality, had his professional career bought out by the young Blue Dragon. The beautiful life of wine, meat, and fighting was completely gone from him. If he wanted to drink and eat meat, he must first learn to speak various dialects and slang of the polar bear men. If he was in a bad mood and wanted to fight, the strong Ogre Neru, a great senior in the arena, would help to teach him the rules by physical means. As for injuries, headaches, and other minor problems, the witch Dr. Paru said that he had all kinds of potions, especially the energy potion that Keyes named Hua Xiang Morality. Drinking a spoonful of it while studying could solve his slack mood. My lords, Crying Face, who had checked his learning progress and drank 3 spoonfuls of the energy potion, said with a sad face, "The 2 polar bear men have approved of me. My pronunciation of the slang today is quite accurate." Keyes had used the glib tongue scroll. In fact, this was an auxiliary tool that Keyes had prepared for Crying Face. But Brew, who always had ideas, thought that learning should be practical, so he only used it when he was checking on Crying Face's learning progress. Brew also understood what Crying Face said just now in Fury Bear's evaluation of him. Don't be arrogant and impetuous. Under the effect of the spell, Brew replied in the standard polar bearman language. Learning is a spiral process. Set a small goal. It will take 2 days to reach the Arrow Fortress they mentioned. During this time, you have to learn how to write the commonly used polar bearman language, about 500 words. If crying was useful, Crying Face didn't mind bawling his eyes out. In the next 2 days, after learning how to write 500 words in the polar bearman language while sitting on a wagon pulled by the Croat hoofbulls, he wanted to cry, but had no tears. The goods that the Leviathan had transported from the Ashen world were far more than what a cargo ship made up of a few NAR-type warships could carry. Their mission was only to establish diplomatic relations. But even so, the cargo unloaded from the ship was piled up with more than 30 Croat hoofbulls. A whole team of desert kobold warriors of the Dragonborn clan were guarding the convoy. As for the cargo ship, after unloading the cargo, it had sailed to the open sea and anchored. The Hualu that followed them all the way dived deep into the sea, and the sleepless undead creatures were watching over the cargo ship at all times. Unlike the Camel Empire, Thick Sturdy Island did not have a desert surrounding it, but the entire island was surrounded by cliffs and precipitous cliffs. Sentry fortresses were scattered all over the mountain roads, forming layers of passes. Because the team had Wolfgar, the son of the polar bearman's chief, and Fury Bear, the chief of the bear tribe, although just like when they first arrived at the port, when many of the passes saw the desert kobolds, they thought that the army of demonic fish monsters had landed and invaded. Fortunately, the 2 noble polar bear men came forward to resolve the misunderstanding. Every sentry fortress along the way would send messengers riding a large mount similar to a mammoth to Miniure in advance to report the news to the Federation's chief. At the same time, some people would also be sent. Depending on the tribe that the pass belonged to, it could be walrus people or polar bear men. They would follow the caravan in the name of protection, but in fact, they were vigilantly monitoring their every move. In Miniure, or the Arrow Fortress, in a stone room at the back of the main hall, several Federation tribal chiefs in luxurious clothes sat around. In the center of the room, an old polar bearman with a gloomy face leaned against a smoky fire. This polar bear wore a moss-yellow robe embroidered with various elemental and wild spirit patterns. His body was loose under the robe, and he had a mouthful of jagged fangs. His tired brown eyes were bloodshot. He muttered the language that the spirits used to communicate with each other that no one else could understand. He casually threw a few pine needles into the fire, making the smoke even thicker and suffocating. It filled the stone room that was so simple and crude that it did not match the layout of the palace. There was only a small window for ventilation. The old polar bearman came forward and took a deep breath. I still need a pinch of bone powder and a little pine cone shell, following the reliable and pure tradition that only existed in the oldest shaman sects. The oldest shaman of the polar bearman race, who had taught the thunder roar, carried out the divination ritual in an orderly but careful manner. Although he looked haggard and could not stand up without help, and he always bent his back when he walked slowly, the aging of his body did not prevent him from listening to the conversations of the various spirits with his soul. But now, no matter how he listened, the spirits that communicated with all things could not give him an accurate answer. The creatures that suddenly appeared on Thick Sturdy Island, and even the island world, seemed to be a mystery in itself. But fortunately, the most sensitive wild spirits and the most active spirit of fire were still calm. They did not sense any hostility from the alien races that had set foot on Thick Sturdy Island. It seemed that it was safe to contact them. The old shaman told the tribal chiefs that were waiting on the scene. He clearly felt that they were relieved. He then asked them to leave the stone room where he lived. Then, with the help of the apprentices, he lay down on a soft leather and fur bed to rest and replenish the energy that he had just consumed in the divination. The old and weak shaman could not help much with the following work, so he simply left it to the young and strong federal tribal chiefs to deal with it carefully. When the young Blue Dragon's caravan entered the Minor Forest, the Crackhoof Bulls pulled the wagon along the lakeside path by Lake Garby. The welcoming team, sent by the Fortress of Arrows, had already lined up on both sides of the path. Although it was called a path, this section of the path was specially dug out from the forest. The path was paved with yellow soil and stacked with stone slabs. The path was wide enough to accommodate 2 or 3 ox carts side by side. As if to welcome the caravan, the lakeside path was now covered with pine branches. When they were stepped on, they would release a refreshing smell. The pine branches are very dry. Sitting in a wagon, Brew's sense of smell was very sensitive. He turned his head and said to Paulu, who was sitting in a nearby wagon, "There's also a smell of dried smoke. It's very easy to ignite." The 2 ogres did not get down from the wagon. Their brother Paulu was now standing behind the diplomat, crying face. The leader of the welcoming team was the captain of the guards of the polar bear chief. He naturally recognized Wolfgar and Fury Bear. Therefore, he first talked to the 2 ogres, wanting to know what to pay attention to when dealing with a foreign caravan. Since Crying Face had turned into a half-man, half-eater, everyone in the welcoming team thought that he was a malnourished polar bear. One of the guards even came up to him and asked kindly, "Are you the guide of this caravan?" "No, I'm..." Because he could not remember how to express the word diplomat in the polar bear language. Cryface was suddenly at a loss for words. He turned around and looked at the ogre behind him. Fortunately, it was not Brew, who always checked his homework. "What happened to your eyes? Did they beat you up?" Crying Face was speechless. This guard was very much like a certain acrobat who was famous for killing with one sentence. Chapter 235. When dawn broke, the earth was filled with morning fog, and Brock could smell the scent of rain. He would prefer to see a clear day, which would help him see the enemy clearly in battle. However, a light drizzle could also keep the warriors awake. In order to keep the existence of the island world a secret, Keyes did not use the identity of the Pasha to mobilize the army of the United States. He only let the Leviathan carry supplies, and more than 1,000 desert kobolds and battle lizardmen warriors quietly pass through the interdimensional portal. In order to make up for the disadvantage in numbers, the young Blue Dragon also mobilized a lot of fanatic armor, so that the Dragon Clan troops could at least have a set for each person, and there were even some extra stocks for replacement. The person in charge of commanding them was the Desert Elf Supreme Warrior, the Sorcerer of Sound, Brock. The Sacred Warrior Johnson stayed behind in Gnome City, taking on the responsibility of logistics supply and temporary supervision and maintenance of the normal operation of the scale of perpetual order. He led a small team of desert kobolds as the vanguard. Brock needed to confirm the terrain information of the Camel Empire obtained from the captives of NAR's fleet, and the main force followed closely behind. For the warriors of the Dragon Clan, crossing the desert barrier was simply too easy. Not only did they easily avoid the camel patrols, but they even completely erased the traces left behind by the march. But as they got closer and closer to the large oasis of the Camel Empire, forests appeared one after another. How to quickly pass through the dense forest became a big problem for the team. According to the captives, these dense forests were an important source of wood for the camel men, and there would be lumberjacks working in them every day. Brock knew very well that if there were lookouts in the forest, then the camel men would definitely be able to discover the vanguard's whereabouts in advance. With a little investigation, they might even be able to discover the Dragon Clan army behind them. I have to think of a way, Brock thought to himself as he leaned against a big tree. The warriors of the Dragon Clan were scattered around, enjoying a short rest during the rapid march. Other than the lookouts who climbed to the top of the big tree to carry out their vigilance duty, the others took out jerky and dried berries and quickly ate with the water in the water bag. Whoosh whoosh. The desert kobold who was in charge of keeping watch seemed to have discovered something and blew the bone whistle. Brock leaped up lightly and took 2 steps on the tree trunk. He then pulled out the scimitar at his waist and used the inner arc of the scimitar to hook and swing on the tree branch. Brock quickly arrived at the top of the tree. The desert kobold, who had been concentrating on observing the movements in the distance, jumped in fright and almost cried out. But the sound warlock only used a little trick to eliminate this accident. "It's me." Brock removed the seal on his voice and asked softly, "What happened? Why did you blow the bone whistle?" The desert kobold, who was in charge of the lookout, did not hesitate and immediately pointed in the direction he was looking at. There are a few tall, humanoid creatures. He thought for a moment and confirmed. They should be hunchbacks. They seem to be here to cut wood. Each of them is carrying an axe. Brock nodded. As a Desert Elf Supreme warrior, his eyesight was very sharp, so he only knew the general direction and quickly locked onto the target. It was a few hunchbacks in plain clothes. They wore a cloth jacket, a simple tight leather jacket, and a pair of trousers. Their feet were bare as they walked in a line in the dense forest. There were not many of them, but each of them was carrying a bronze axe. The hunchback walking at the back of the team was holding a rope in his hand. He was leading a few cleft hoof bulls that were probably used to drag the cutwood. When the vanguard team had been marching, Brock had found that there were actually some large carnivores living in the forest. By the standards of ordinary mortals in the Ash world, walking here could be said to be a life-threatening situation. But looking at the fearless look of the hunchback loggers as they shuttled through the dense forest, and considering their size, it was not difficult to come to the conclusion that the fighting strength of the hunchback race was generally not too weak, not to mention that the axe used for cutting could also be regarded as a weapon. Don't blow the whistle. Go down and inform them one by one. Blatch's lips moved slightly without uttering a word, and the order was accurately transmitted to the ears of the desert kobolds beside him. Tell them to gather quietly. We have a war to fight. In fact, war was sometimes like this, when both sides did not know the actual situation of the other side. They could only test each other first. The Dragonborn clan did not carry any heavy weapons, and Keyes did not arrange for them to come with the expectation that they could attack the city. As long as Brock could lead the army deep into the Empire's hinterland like Hannibal, it would be enough to contain and attract the main military force. From the high-level captives of the Nair fleet, the young Blue Dragon learned that the standing army of the Hunchbacks was about 20,000 people. Including the private soldiers of the Twin Peaks aristocrats, the qualified army would not exceed 50,000. In addition, the depth of the island where the Hunchback Empire was located was not large, and the entire population was only about a few 100,000 people, so the mobilization ability was quite limited. The outcome of the war between mortals had long been determined, and ending the war was only a matter of time. The only variable was the Hunchback God, known as the King of Twin Peaks. Even if he was an insignificant existence among the gods, a god was a god after all. In order to deal with him, Keyes had to concentrate on preparing a gift that could seal the deal. And before the appearance of the Hunchback God who was working hard to create his own kingdom, the work of causing unrest in the Hunchback Empire and weakening the foundation of their faith would be completed by Brock's 1,000-man team. This was also the reason why the young Blue Dragon had to pay a certain price for all the Desert Kobold warriors to be equipped with a set of Berserker armor. The dice have been thrown, and the chips on the table must be well prepared. The first team will flank from the left, and the second team will attack directly. Using the lush branches and leaves of the trees to hide his body, Brock used a sound spell so that only the Desert Kobolds under his command could hear his voice. Be careful, try not to kill those hunchbacks. Because the desert elves looked somewhat similar to humans, in order to prevent the hunchback lumberjack from mistakenly recognizing them and affecting the follow-up plan, Brock did not attack himself, and only let the members of the Dragonborn clan attack. In order to make the hunchbacks think that the attackers were just a group of monsters that suddenly appeared before the attack, the desert kobolds put down the sharp blades and spears in their hands, and only used their fangs and teeth as weapons. Of course, they did not remove the Berserker armor that was similar to the skin of a living creature. Otherwise, with the Desert Kobold's barehanded combat power, a large number of them might really be killed by the Hunchbacks with bronze axes. The Desert Kobolds used the signature of their race, which was similar to a dog's bark, as the signal to launch the attack. Unfortunately, the Hunchbacks had never seen a kobold species, so they did not know that this was a communication method of some kind of intelligent creature. They only thought that the desert kobolds were some kind of monsters that suddenly appeared in the dense forest and launched a fierce attack on them. Chapter 236. What is this thing? My ankle is injured. Be careful. These monsters are very strong. After giving up the use of weapons, with the height of the desert kobolds, they could only attack the thighs of the hunchbacks with their sharp teeth. On the other hand, the hunchback kobolds could easily chop off their heads with their axes. If not for the full protection of the fanatic armor, several desert kobolds would have been hammered on the spot when the hunchback kobolds attacked. In view of their own disadvantage, this group of warriors of the Dragon Clan quickly gave up the attack method of standing up straight. They decisively lay on the ground, using the advantage of agility brought by their own body size and the strength bonus of the fanatic armor to target the opponent's toes and ankles. Not long after, a few of the hunchback lumberjacks appeared with injured ankles. Judging the situation, they wisely chose to retreat and even left all of the crack hoof bulls to attract the attention of the desert kobolds. Team 1, Team 2, stop the attack and capture those crack hoof bulls, Brock, who was hiding in the canopy, immediately ordered. Team 3, hide your body and tail. Be careful not to be exposed. Let's see where these hunchbacks can take us. Using the sound spell, the desert elf's voice clearly lingered in the ears of every member of the Vanguard team, but the hunchbacks who fled in a hurry could not hear even a word. They only hoped to retreat as soon as possible and escape with their lives. Except for Team 3, who was responsible for tracking, the rest of the Dragon Clan warriors stopped chasing and began to pretend to hunt the crack hoof bulls in the area, which were obviously easier to deal with than the hunchbacks with weapons. Those damn monsters. A camel lumberjack who was supporting his fellow workers was filled with hatred. They are killing the crack-hoofed bulls. We have to hurry back and report to Lord Berber so that he can burn those guys to death with flames. Originally, in this dense forest, or in the territory of the Hunchback Empire, the Hunchbacks were the race at the top of the food chain. But who would have thought that such a monster would suddenly appear, fierce and agile with sharp teeth and claws? It dared to attack a whole team of hunchback lumberjacks, and, at the same time, it won and drove away the opponent. This was really absolutely unforgivable, whether from the perspective of the honor of the race or the interests of the big sawmill. The camel lumberjacks had the same belief at this time, and that was to get reinforcements as soon as possible. They believed that even if the monsters had sharp teeth and claws and moved as fast as the wind, they would still be vulnerable in front of the camel warriors. Moreover, Master Berber was a shaman who could use elemental spells. But what the lumberjacks didn't know was that not far behind them, danger was following them like a shadow. Upon receiving Brock's orders, a few desert kobolds who were adept at tracking their prey followed behind the camels. Although they weren't familiar with the path in the forest, with their keen sense of smell, they didn't have to worry about losing their trail, even if they were far away. As they advanced, the desert kobolds of the third squad would carve the unique markings of their clan on the tree trunk from time to show the way for the members behind them. After walking for about an hourglass, the desert kobolds who were following them stopped. The camel lumberjacks walked out of the forest and entered a camp with a wall made of logs. Not long after they entered, the gate of the camp quickly closed, and many fully armed camel warriors climbed up the high platform behind the wall. Their eyes were bright, and their faces were gloomy as they stared in the direction of the dense forest, as if they were on guard against the strange monsters that were hibernating and could appear at any time. This camp was a typical jammock, which meant village or town in the camel people's language. Most of the camel people who lived here were related to each other by blood, and they all belonged to a noble family with two peaks. As workers in the sawmill, the residents here were all one-peak camels. The only two-peak camel was the manager of this jammock and the commander of the noble's private army, Berber Two-Peak. After reporting the experience of the monster attack, a few uninjured camel lumberjacks were immediately brought to Berber's residence. As an elemental shaman and a two-peak noble himself, Berber's room was much more elegant than the other camels. A few small wooden cabinets and a work table were placed in order around the room, and a stove was hung on a triangular iron frame by the wall. 2 iron rings on the wall were covered with torches, and there was a double-open bookcase on the wall. Many leather scrolls and pottery tablets were piled up inside. The owner of the room sat cross-legged on the ground, and there was a long and narrow table beside him, covered with a blue blanket. There was a pottery tablet on the table, and Berber was currently comparing the contents of the tablet with the information recorded on it while using a small knife to modify the totem pole in his hand. "What kind of monster did you encounter?" Berber asked after he finished modifying the last pattern on the totem pole. Several camel lumberjacks waiting at the door hurriedly bowed to salute and then elected the oldest among them to answer the elemental shaman's question. Reported to Master Berber, "Those monsters are very strange. We have never encountered them in the forest before when we were logging." "Never seen them before?" Berber had a puzzled look on his face. "I heard from his servants that some of you were injured, but the injuries were not fatal. The wounds were all around the ankle or calf." The camel lumberjacks nodded desperately. "Sir, those monsters were short in stature. They could walk upright on their hind legs, and they could also lie on all fours on the ground. They were agile and had great strength." As they spoke, they handed over a woodcutter's axe with a broken wooden handle. On the jagged surface of the axe, there were still marks left behind by the desert kobolds when they tried to bite it. With just a glance, Berber concluded that the lumberjacks in front of him were not lying. The distance between the teeth marks was not large, which meant that the attacker's mouth was narrow and its body was not large. However, the cut was very smooth, and the wooden handle was almost bitten off, which meant that the attacker's bite force was shocking. From a certain point of view, it did indeed prove that the attacker had great strength. "Sir," an attendant quickly walked in. The warriors formed a patrol team and just searched the forest around Jamek for a while and found some strange footprints on the ground. "How many are there?" Berber quickly asked. If there were too many monsters that suddenly appeared, it was very likely that they were related to the demonic fish. If that was the case, this matter would become very troublesome and the level of danger would increase accordingly. The attendant was already prepared. After hearing Berber's question, he immediately replied, "There are not many footprints, and from the shape, there are no web membranes between the toes. It is very similar to a lizard." Berber nodded. If it was not a monster under the command of the demonic fish, then he was confident that he could eliminate it as soon as possible and restore the normal operations of Jamek, which was supported by the lumberjacks. He quickly ordered, "Inform the patrol team to gather at the entrance. Organize the youths in the walled city to join in and prepare to pull the net to search. I will be there soon and try to eliminate the hidden danger of the monsters in the forest before sunset." Then Berber said to the camel lumberjacks, "Those monsters know how to track you, so they should have a certain level of intelligence." He paused. "But if you can escape unscathed, it means that they're not very strong. So we have to track them back and catch them off guard. You will personally lead the way." The single-humped camel men nodded their heads in agreement and left together. Some of them went straight home and wore the leather armor passed down by their ancestors. Others went to the coppersmith shop to borrow a whetstone to sharpen their axes. After they left, Berber Twin Humps quickly took out many totem poles with various functions. Although he had passed the initiation and was an elemental shaman, he could not be compared to those masters. Thus, to ensure that this operation was foolproof, Berber specially brought the totem poles with him to enhance his spells. "The few of you carry the totem poles and follow me." Berber, who was wearing a set of bronze plate armor over his dark blue robe, instructed the apprentices who were also his attendants, "Stay alert before the battle. Stay calm during the battle." With the arrival of the highest authority of Jamek, the noisy patrol team gathered at the entrance of the walled city quickly quieted down. As a two-humped camel man, Berber was naturally much taller than his one-humped compatriots. As a result, he stood out among the latter. Split into groups of 10, and there must be at least 2 warriors in each group. Search the forest horizontally. Don't let go of any traces. After he gave the order, groups of armed camels immediately set off and walked into the depths of the forest in an orderly manner. Berber took a totem pole from an apprentice and opened his mouth to chant a spell to summon the elements. After a few breaths, the hem of his robe moved even though there was no wind. The air element responded to the shaman's call and was interacting with his elemental spirit. "Swift wind, nimble wind," Berber muttered in a low voice using the language he used to communicate with spirits. "Please hear my request. Go to the forest and help me." In order to communicate with the elements, unless the elemental spirit was a master shaman who could translate his words to the elements, any other elemental shaman had to be like Berber and speak softly and slowly. After summoning the air elemental, he handed the totem pole back to the apprentice for safekeeping. He himself picked up a bronze short spear with a steel blade and followed in the footsteps of Jamaica's patrol team, walking into the dense forest. With the help of the totem pole, Berber was constantly in contact with the air element he had summoned. The air element became his eyes and ears, turning into a gust of wind as it shuttled through the forest, searching for the desert kobold's whereabouts. Over there, the elemental spirit in the depths of his soul received the air element's message and immediately reminded Berber. The latter immediately reacted and was about to order his attendants to gather the patrol team. However, at this moment, something strange happened. Chapter 237. If he had a choice, Berber would rather die on this day. Unfortunately, the weak did not have a right to choose. Not long after he walked into the forest, he was ambushed. Screech! A dizzying sound suddenly sounded. With the elemental shaman as the center, including the apprentices carrying the totem poles, several hunchbacks suddenly fell to the ground, clutching their aching heads. It was an ambush. Berber had just reacted when there was a sound of wind behind him. He instinctively used a short spear to block, but it did not work. A pair of delicate palms imprinted on his ears without any fanciful moves. After using the sound spell to ambush, Brock showed his superb ability as a supreme warrior and took down the enemy spellcaster. However, he was very restrained. He only stunned and did not kill. After all, Berber had 2 peaks behind him. This was actually very persuasive. It was especially persuasive when persuading the single-peak hunchback in Jamek to surrender. "How can we trust you?" Hearing the sound of battle behind him, the captain of the 2-peak noble's private army immediately gathered the search team that was still pulling the net and immediately retreated. At this moment, he was confronting the attacker who had taken hostages. Despicable monster. Due to the use of a glib tongue enchantment scroll, Brock could communicate with the hunchbacks without hindrance for a period of time. However, in order to maintain his character setting or monster setting, he still hid in the canopy and used the sound spell to play a double act in front of the hunchbacks with a desert kobold. I can guarantee a lot of things. The performer selected from the warriors of the Dragonborn clan opened and closed his mouth. Under the effect of the sound spell, Brock's words seemed to be coming from his mouth. For example, I could decide to let you warriors go first. For example, after receiving the compensation, this elemental shaman can also live. For example, if the residents of Jamek are well-behaved, they will not be harmed. Hearing that he was deliberately put on the second condition, the private army captain blinked his eyes. The desert elves, who were high up, keenly captured this micro-expression message. As expected, compared to lumber Jamek, elemental shamans were the true targets of the noble's protection. After some bargaining, the captain of the private army withdrew all his warriors, leaving only the residents of Jamek and Berber as hostages. Then, he brought along Brock's greedy request made by the desert kobold and walked out of the gate to report to the nobles who were in charge of the area. In order to ensure the safety of the elemental shamans, all the youths in Jamek were tied up by their compatriots and forced to become hostages. They were locked up in the mansion that originally belonged to Berber and awaited their fate. Their families were confined in their own homes and were not allowed to go out. This also played a role of mutual restraint with the young hostages. They had no choice but to do so. After all, with just the number of people in the Vanguard team, even with Blatch overseeing it, it was too difficult for them to defend a large village like the Hunchback Jamek. It wasn't until 10 minutes past midnight that the remaining Dragon Clan troops finally passed through the dense forest, following the marks left behind by the Vanguard team. They walked through the gate of the Hunchback Jamek's camp. Sufficient manpower brought more order to the place. The arrival of this otherworldly army not only filled the gap in the guards, but also broke the containment strategy that the Vanguard team had been pursuing in order to maintain the balance for the past half a day. The abundance of building materials here has exceeded my expectations, but it's just as well. After checking the inventory in Jameka's warehouse and seeing the piles of lumber that had been simply processed, Blatch decisively gave an order to the warriors of the Dragonborn clan. Mobilize all the Hunchback used to build the wall. He will supervise and guide them. No one is allowed to slack off or be restless. Violators will be killed on the spot. We have a tough battle to fight after this. With more than 1,000 desert kobolds armed with weapons, and more than 3 times the manpower, suppressing less than 300 Hunchback youths was not a problem. Faced with the threat of scimitars and spears, there were no hotheads among the Hunchback lumberjacks. At dawn, the released Hunchback men began to work. Some of them were in charge of moving the logs in the warehouse. Some were in charge of building scaffolding. Some were in charge of fine carpentry. And some were sent to the nearby river to pick up pebbles or excavate clay and river sand. The first thing that could be seen was the scaffolding that was quickly erected around Jamek. Although each scaffold was as tall as 2 or 3 desert kobolds stacked together, in reality, it was only the height of a hunchback. With these scaffolds as the framework, baskets of pebbles that were brought back from the river were placed into them, piling up the embryonic form of the city wall. Under the guidance of the desert kobolds, some hunchbacks mixed the river sand and clay together, adding water and stirring it into mortar. Then, they used hard wooden planks as cleavers smearing a layer of mortar on every layer of pebbles. Due to the abundant manpower and the fact that most of the camel lumberjacks were strong, before noon, the trapezoidal wall that surrounded the entire camp, made of pebbles and filled with mortar, was already 7 or 8 cubits high, and it was still rapidly increasing in height. By the time the sun set in the afternoon, the scaffolding had all been buried into the pebbles surrounding the wall, and it was impossible to see its original appearance. Moreover, the city wall was modeled after Medici's redoubt, with platforms that could be used for battle protruding in the middle of several sections of the city wall. When the sun set, many bonfires were lit around the camp. The relatives in Jamek were allowed to bring food and water to the youths who had worked all day, but the children were still ordered to stay at home. As night fell, the work of building the city wall continued. In order to stimulate the efficiency of the hunchbacks, Brock ordered all the laborers to release the hunchback lumberjacks and their families when the city wall could be built to the same level as the original log fence. They were also allowed to leave with all their family belongings except for food. For this hope, the hunchback youths working even harder to build the city wall. Perhaps some of them had already thought that the city wall, which was quickly built, would definitely be a hindrance to the army that would come later and might even cause a lot of casualties. But that was a matter for the future, and it was someone else's business. Just like when the nobles' private soldiers left, they completely abandoned the residents of Jamek for the safety of themselves and the elemental shamans. These youths also had to give up something for the safety of themselves and their families. Chapter 238. This town is a bait. Brock explained a strategy to a few desert kobolds and battle lizardmen captains. When the camels come to attack, we will go behind them and attack. This was a typical battle strategy of the desert elves. Although this Dragonborn clan army did not have four-legged warhorses, everyone was equipped with mad armor, which allowed them to move faster than horses and come and go like the wind. However, the key to victory still depended on whether the armed lumberjack Jamek could withstand the first wave of attacks from the camels. If it could be like a magnet and firmly attract the attacking army, then the surprise attack from behind would be effective. After the construction of the wall was completed, Brock immediately fulfilled his promise and released all the camel residents, leaving only their food. Anyway, with the elemental shaman as a hostage, the bargaining chip was enough. Moreover, if the camel army began to attack this wall, leaving so many camels within the wall would be a hidden danger. At the same time, the defensive equipment privately made by the desert kobolds was also placed on the wall. On the morning of the third day after occupying Jamek, all the work came to an end. Rolling logs, stones, and nail boards were piled up on the wall in an orderly manner. The remaining mad armor was dismantled, and the ballistas and trebuchets made of flesh were also set up. In order to prevent the enemy from forming a formation and charging, some of the Dragonborn clan warriors worked through the night and dug densely packed horse traps around the camp. Some of the more vicious ones even placed wooden spikes in these shallow pits that were only slightly bigger than the feet of the camels. The private soldiers of the nobles who had been released did not let their preparations go to waste. Having received a condition that was impossible to fulfill, the Twin Peaks nobles in charge of Jamek did not hesitate at all. They quickly gathered a larger and better equipped army and returned to this place. When they saw the newly repaired wall made of earth and stone, everyone could not help but gasp. The Twin Peak nobles who personally commanded this army frowned. In order to arrive faster, this camel army did not bring heavy siege weapons. Therefore, when faced with the sturdy wall, they were somewhat helpless. However, when he saw the gate of the camp, the Twin Peak nobles finally found a flaw. He could not help but laugh coldly. Even if they learned the basics of building a city, monsters are still monsters. With his good eyesight, he saw the desert kobolds on the wall. He realized that those fellows were as short and ugly as the captain of the private soldiers had reported. Shield and axemen, charge and break open the gate of Jamek. After receiving the order, a team of camels wearing bronze plate armor and holding large shields and axes rushed out of the crowd and towards the gate of the camp. They spread out, using large shields in front of them to protect themselves. They lowered their heads and charged. As long as they got close to the gate, they would be able to break it open in 2 or 3 swings with the large axes in their hands. However, things always go against one's wishes, and they always happen so unexpectedly. The giant shield protected the hunchbacked axemen very well, and at the same time, it also completely blocked their vision. After stepping into the horse traps, they fell to the ground one after another. Their weight, coupled with their heavy armor and the inertia that was proportional to their mass, caused every hunchback shield and axe-bearer to break their ankles. Those who stepped on the wooden spikes in the horse pit even bled profusely and fell to the ground, unable to get up. Shaman, Master, quickly helped them retreat. In his hurry, the Twin Peak nobles almost forgot his etiquette. However, it was no wonder that he was so anxious. After all, those shield and axemen were the strongest warriors under his command. Hearing this order, the elemental shaman standing next to the Twin Peak noble turned even more gloomy. He did not agree with the actions of directly attacking the monsters without regard for the hostage Berber's life. It was not easy for an elemental shaman to cultivate. Every one of them was a valuable asset of the Camel Empire. Furthermore, although Berber was not close to him, he had once been a disciple of Master Gear-san. They were fellow disciples. However, he still did as he was told. Obeying the command of the Twin Peak nobles was the tradition of the Camel Army. Moreover, he did not want those elite warriors to die in vain. Chanting a spell to communicate with the elements, the elemental shaman plunged his totem pole into the ground. The essence of the air element and the earth element hovered around him, listening to his elemental spirit. A gust of sand rose from under his feet, accompanied by a breeze. It intensified when he was a dozen steps away from the elemental shaman. The sandstorm blocked the vision of everyone present, causing the desert kobolds who were shooting at the wounded to lose their targets. When the camel warriors who were helping the wounded carefully carried their comrades back into the formation, the elemental shaman, who was sweating profusely because he had been concentrating on casting spells, finally stopped chanting. As he pressed down with both hands, the dust floating in the air fell instantly, filling up the horse traps on the road leading to the camp. I need to rest. After the elemental shaman completed the ritual of summoning the sandstorm, his footsteps were a little weak. He decisively reported his situation to the Twin Peak nobles. In 2 hourglasses, I'll be able to restore my ability to support spells. As the commander, the Twin Peak nobles nodded. He also knew that before these elemental shamans became masters, communicating with the elements was an activity that consumed both mental and physical strength. The more powerful the elemental spell was, the harder it was to sustain it. Whip archers, get ready to suppress the attacks of the monsters on the wall. The Twin Peak nobles changed tactics. He wanted to provide some help to the warriors with shields and axes. Spear team, mobilize people to be responsible for shield defense. The rest of the axes, abandon your shields and attack at full speed. As the order was given, teams of camel whip archers surrounded the walls of Jamek and spread out in a semicircle. Each of them was separated by at least a person's distance. At first, the rain of arrows was a little sparse. Later, as the whips spun faster and faster, the number of arrows in everyone's dart decreased rapidly. The dense rain of arrows suppressed the defenders on the wall until they could not lift their heads. According to the plan, the desert kobolds on the wall quickly bent down and hid in the small holes that looked like cat ears that they had dug out beforehand. They let the whips and arrows fly over their heads, nailing into the wall or falling behind it. They would definitely not shoot back and die for nothing. Without the suppression of the horse traps and arrows, the camel soldiers quickly rushed to the gate of the camp. Then, they swung their arms and started hacking with their axes, making a series of clanging sounds. After a short while, the wooden fences were cut down one after another, and a large hole was dug at the bottom of the gate. It was unknown who was the first to throw an axe, but it directly cut off the rope hanging above the fence gate. Without the support at the bottom, the top half of the fence collapsed to the ground. Charge in. Don't leave a single monster alive. Seeing all this, the two-peak noble immediately ordered. Take note that they have Berber shaman as a hostage. Force him to a place and leave him to me. He knew very well that under this attack, although there was a high probability that the kidnapped Berber would be killed by the angry monsters, they still had to go through the necessary procedures. After all, ignoring the life of an elemental shaman would still attract a lot of criticism. I hope you guys are decisive, the two-peak noble thought to himself. As a failure who got close to Gearsan, Berber really doesn't need to continue living. From a certain point of view, his wish did indeed work. The defenders of the Dragonborn clan were very decisive. Once the gate of the camp was breached, the desert kobolds launched a counterattack while the shield and axe wielders were guarding the gate and waiting for the subsequent spear wielders to arrive. Moo moo moo. The painful howls of the split-hoofed bulls came one after another. Then, the originally docile giant beast's four hooves moved wildly, causing the earth to tremble. The sharp-eyed hunchback had already seen the first split-hoofed bull running from the corner of the street in the center of Jamek. Its tail was firmly tied with a burning pine branch, and its buttocks seemed to be smeared with grease. The burning pine branch sputtered some sparks and easily ignited its entire buttocks. Pain instantly filled its brain. Flames, roars, and frenzied split-hoofed bulls formed a terrifying scene, and all of this was rapidly approaching the hunchback. Then the second one, the third one, up the wall. Looking at his comrade who wanted to block with his shield, the shield and axe-wielding captain slapped the back of the idiot's head. Get up the wall quickly. Let the spear wielders at the back disperse. Be careful to avoid the frenzied, split-hoofed bulls. Don't get hit by them. But how could the desert kobolds on the wall let them do as they wished? When the shield and axe-wielders began to climb the wall, the ballista that had not been used before immediately fired at the gate. With the flesh of the biomass armor and the steel spears used as the arrows, the bronze plate armor worn by the hunchback shield and axe wielders was like a piece of paper shattering with a single hit. It did not pose the slightest bit of obstruction. The split-hoofed bulls, or rather, the flaming bulls, immediately charged out of the gate and collided with the spear-wielding hunchback warriors. Stimulated by the pain of being burned by the flames, these beasts ignored the death brought by the spears and trampled many hunchback warriors under their hooves. The eyes of the Twin Peaks noble in command at the back were about to pop out of their sockets. He personally snatched the poleaxe from the hands of the guard beside him and wanted to lead the charge to kill the frenzied split-hoof bulls to prevent this disaster. Thanks to the camel men's physique, they weren't any weaker than the cleft-hoof bulls. In addition, they had weapons. After expending a lot of effort, they finally killed all of the bulls. Stepping on a stream formed by the blood of the split-hoofed bulls mixed with the blood of the hunchbacks, the exhausted Twin Peaks noble immediately ordered the soldiers, who were still in shock. In the current situation, even if the gate of Jamek, which was occupied by the monsters, was opened, he could not order the soldiers to force their way in. However, things did not go as planned once again. More than 1,000 Dragonborn warriors who had been lying in ambush in the dense forest for a long time suddenly charged out and launched a surprise attack on the hunchback army that had lost all will to fight. Chapter 239. The word tragic was no longer enough to describe the final scene of the war. Just as the camels had just slaughtered the frenzied crack-hoofed bulls, they themselves were at the mercy of the enemy. Even if compared to the number of deaths, there were actually more who escaped with injuries. However, these camels who claimed to be qualified warriors had actually lost all courage. And this was the result of the desert elf Brock's deliberate action after receiving the young blue dragon's instructions. The escaping soldiers could spread fear, and treating the injured would drag down the camel empire. Even the primitive god would be hurt because of this. In the final melee, of course, the commander of the two-peak noble in the camel army was decapitated by a lizard man. The other high-ranking general, the elemental shaman who had summoned the sandstorm, was once again captured alive by Brock using the method he used to ambush Berber. Due to the early arrangements among this batch of Dragonborn clan warriors who came from across the plain, there were actually quite a number of people who had a rough understanding of metal smelting technology. After the war ended, they quickly began to collect the bronze weapons and armor left behind by the camels on the battlefield. Then, they used Jamahiri's coppersmith shop to smelt and recycle them. They added more tin powder to the melted bronze. When the color of the copper liquid turned into a lemon color, they would put in some leaves that resembled pecans that they found in the dense forest. After that, the copper liquid would be poured into a mold filled with wet sand. After a hiss, a shiny golden ballista arrow would be made. It would be polished with a grinding wheel and sharpened for the ballista arrow. Compared to the bronze weapons and armor commonly used by the camels, the arrowheads cast with this copper-tin alloy ratio were a little more brittle. However, their hardness was higher, and the armor-piercing effect was naturally better. In this way, the problem of the ammunition for the ballista was solved, and a large part of the logistical pressure was relieved. It was also not like when they were focusing fire on the camel shield and axemen, where they still needed to use the spears in the hands of the desert kobolds as arrows for the ballista. In addition to rushing the production of weapons, in order to prevent the plague from breeding here, Brock also let the Dragonborn clan warriors carefully clean up the battlefield. The corpses of the camels were burned on the spot. The dead crack-hoofed bulls were also emptied of their internal organs and smoked into meat jerky to be used as food supplies. After a day of rest, the army from another plain departed from the logging town and charged towards the nearby Jamek the Hunchback. Because the Twin Peak nobles who were in charge of this place had been eliminated, and they had the ballistas to knock on the gate, they attacked and destroyed several cities in the next few days. Of course, with the military strength of more than 1,000 members of the Dragonborn clan, it was impossible for Brock to divide his forces to take over the management of the Jamek. In fact, when he attacked these hunchback settlements, he mostly forced them to surrender and renounce their belief in the hunchback god. Every time they conquered a Jamek, the first thing the desert kobolds did was to destroy the totem that was used to worship the camel god. They also used their lives to threaten every camel to voluntarily abandon the king of Twin Peaks. This also caused strong resistance from the hunchback people, but they were all suppressed by the warriors of the Dragon clan using force and bloody means. It was never easy to change social customs. As for the follow-up, Keyes had a backup plan, so Brock did not need to worry about it. He only needed to stab the heart of the Hunchback Empire like what Hannibal did to Rome, and his task would be considered complete. A fist with chainmail banged on the door, and nails flew out from the door. The hunchbacked attendants pushed each other to open the door and respectfully retreated to the sides to make way for the newcomers. Their arrival brought a gust of cold night wind and blew out a few candles made of crack-hoofed bull fat. The flames of the torches on the wall also swayed, and it looked a little scary. At this time, in the palace, there was an endless stream of attendants running in and out, like an ant hill that had been overturned by wasps. The roar of the hunchback emperor came from the depths of the hall. Just like a child who messed up, the hunchback priest who walked to the front tilted his head and said to the two companions behind him, "Our Lord Officiant has always been like this, communicating by roaring." Hearing the news from the attendant beside his ear, the hunchback emperor stopped insulting the Twin Peaks nobles present. He cast his gaze into the distance, and three vague figures walked in from the dim door, passed through the many big shots who were prostrating on the ground, and came to him. As the officiant of the Twin Peaks Temple and the ruler of the Empire's mortals, the hunchback emperor naturally recognized the three priests who served the Twin Peaks king. But why did they come at this time? Moreover, their clothes looked very different from before. Lord Officiant, the leader, who was also the oldest priest among the three, greeted first. As he bowed with his hand on his chest, the chainmail on his body clashed with the black armor, making a clang, clang, clang sound. "The great Twin Peaks king asked me to greet you." The hunchback emperor's eyes first turned cold, and then he immediately controlled his expression. "To the great Twin Peaks king, the protector of the hunchback empire, and my ancestor," he deliberately emphasized the innate nobility of his bloodline. "Silent cultivators, Why are you not serving in the tower of the hunchback god? But here at this time, the so-called silent cultivator was actually a kind of hunchback god priest. Unlike other priests, they did not shoulder the responsibility of going deep into the secular world to spread their faith, and they would not use the priest's divine spells to serve the Twin Peaks nobles everywhere. They only had one job, and that was to stay in the Twin Peaks temple and serve the Twin Peaks king devoutly. The silent cultivators were all fanatics of the hunchback god, and there were only about 10 of them in the entire hunchback empire. The hunchback god sent us here to help the officiant win the war. It was still the old priest who answered the hunchback emperor's question. Also, from now on, there is no longer the title of silent cultivator. The great hunchback god has changed our profession to war priest. The Twin Peaks had planned to get involved in the war field for many years. And finally, there was a result. The enthusiastic young blue dragon contributed greatly. The desert elves led the army of the Dragonborn clan and fought in various parts of the hunchback empire for days, which really stimulated the believers of the hunchback god and made them have a need to find a way to deal with the war. The hunchback god was a product of the worship of the ancestral spirits and did not have a divinity, so his plasticity was very strong. Embark's act of destroying his totem statue and ordering his believers to cut off their faith by insulting him, while weakening his power, once again strengthened his plasticity. It was not surprising that the war priest could be born. However, his power was damaged, and it was a fact that was already set in stone, and this was also the result that Keys wanted. There was a certain contractual relationship between the believers and the gods. The mortals gave their faith, and the gods protected the mortals. For the Twin Peaks king, a primitive god who did not have the ability to create a god kingdom and accumulate petitioners, after the mortals died, they would still contribute part of their souls. As a rule that maintained the stability of the multiverse, this contract between the gods and mortals had always been a fair exchange of equal value. The weaker gods received more preferential treatment, so naturally they had to pay more. For the hunchback god, after achieving the priesthood of the war field, he had no other choice. If he could not obtain benefits for the hunchbacks and defeat the army of the Dragonborn clan on the battlefield, death was the only result he could get. Chapter 240. After drinking the yellow soup, his anger began to rise again. And the target of the hunchback emperor's anger was the war priests who were arrogantly arranging various affairs in the camp, making themselves look like puppets. After they met the emperor with the hunchback god's edict, the entire hunchback empire was mobilized. All the Twin Peak nobles sent out their most elite private soldiers and gathered around their Caesar, forming a powerful army. There was only one meaning for the existence of this army, and that was to find the Dragonborn clan warriors led by Brock who were attacking cities in the Empire and force them to fight a decisive battle, completely eliminating this military armed group that was roaming and committing crimes in the Empire. No matter if it was based on the ratio of the standing troops in the army or the loyalty of the Twin Peak nobles, the command of this army should belong to the Hunchback Emperor. But due to the intervention of the Hunchback God, even the Emperor could not go against the will of the Twin Peak King. The ones who were truly in charge of the largest army in the history of the Hunchback Empire were the newly converted war priests. They can't even perform basic healing. He threw the golden wine cup to the corner of the camp, letting it hit his steel armor and dented a corner. He complained to the attendant beside him, but the latter did not dare to answer. Instead, he showed an expression of, "Please be careful with your words," but it was of no use. Suddenly, they say they can play with swords and guns and lead troops to war. What kind of priests are they? What kind of battle have they seen? Resentment that seemed to have materialized gushed out from his words. Suddenly, the elemental shaman who had been staying in the shadows of the camp walked out and signaled to the Hunchback Emperor. Only then did he stop his complaints. Not long after, the curtain of the camp was lifted and a war priest walked in. After carelessly bowing, he said, "Caesar, all the preparations have been completed. If nothing unexpected happens, we will be able to take care of those monsters tonight." The Hunchback Emperor was a little surprised that this war priest did not call him efficient, but instead called him Caesar, which the Twin Peak nobles often called him. But he did not show in the end, only giving a perfunctory, understood, and ending the conversation. In the eyes of the Emperor, the army of the Dragon Clan was just a monster that had conquered a few Jamek. He did not think that the other party had the ability to overthrow the rule of the Camel Empire. Therefore, the war priest's action of commanding the Camel army with the Edict of the Twin Peak King was to use a war that could be said to be a sure win to fight for prestige among the ordinary camels and even usurp the power in his hands. The former warlord named Gearsand was like that, and now these war priests were like that. However, due to the Twin Peak King's orders, he couldn't do anything about it. This made the Hunchback Emperor extremely angry, and his expression kept changing. However, even if he had control over an empire, his vision could not be compared to that of a god. Although the Hunchback God's ability was limited, and he was still unable to detect the intentions of the Dragon Clan's army, he could guess that their intentions were not as simple as just occupying a few Jamek, and the blasphemous behavior that they forcibly promoted was even more poisonous to him. Therefore, after gaining some superficial knowledge of the authority of war, he immediately forcibly changed his profession from a priest to a war priest. At the same time, he began to use his divine power to simulate divine spells, a spell that could be used to ask questions of an unknown existence, which could be used to obtain information, forcibly analyzing the weaknesses of the Dragon Clan's army in order to win the battle and eliminate any hidden dangers. Due to the asymmetry of information, the questions that the Hunchback God could ask were very limited, so the answers he received were mostly vague and specious. However, through the hard currency of paying divine power, he was still able to ask more questions than the average spellcaster. After hundreds of attempts, he finally obtained the information that the other party is afraid of the cold and is not good at night battles. In fact, the situation was indeed so. The warriors of the Dragon Clan were composed of desert kobolds and a small number of battle lizard men. Although they had a certain blood relationship with the Megalosaurus was a warm-blooded creature, and they were all cold-blooded creatures. In the cold night, their mobility would be greatly reduced. Although the desert kobolds were actually a branch of the kobolds, in order to cope with the temperature difference between day and night in the desert, they had evolved a special body mechanism that absorbed and stored heat during the day and released it at night, thus warming up their blood. However, due to the racial template, the flaw could not be completely compensated for. As for the battle lizard men, their resistance to the cold was even weaker than that of the desert kobolds. If the temperature was too low, not only would their bodily functions decline, but they might also directly fall into a stiff state similar to hibernation. These problems had never been shown before. First, it was because every warrior of the Dragon Clan was equipped with the fanatic armor, which could offset part of the physical decline brought about by the lowering of the temperature at night. Second, it was because compared to the temperature difference between day and night in the desert of Medici in the Ashen world, the Camel Empire in the island world was much milder. It had to be admitted that the Hunchback God had indeed used the clergy ability of the Bloodshed Land to find an opportunity for his believers to defeat the enemy and win. The war priests who were inspired by the Hunchback God received this important message at the first moment. In response to the Dragon Clan's offensive characteristics of avoiding the enemy's main force and attacking their weak points, these war priests and the two peak nobles who governed the various Jamek decided after repeated communication. They would transfer some of the defensive forces in the interior of Jamek, where the terrain was flat and easy to attack but difficult to defend, and supplement the nearby Jamek, which had obvious terrain advantages, to make it look like a hard bone to chew. They would artificially construct a path that was suitable for the enemy's attack, induce them to continue to attack, and make the enemy tired from continuous battles. Then, they would set up an ambush on their path of advance, and the main force would find a suitable night to launch an attack. In the beginning, Brock led the desert kobolds into the trap step by step, just as the camel men had expected, but who would have thought that at the last moment, the enemy seemed to have become suspicious and stopped after conquering and occupying a part of Jamek. Just like what they had done in the logging town in the beginning, they enslaved the local camel men, cut wood for fences, and carried earth to build a city. After the defensive fortifications were completed, they once again drove out the camel men who lived there, leaving only the dragon clan to guard this Jamek. However, since this was Jamek that was carefully selected by the war priests in the first place, even if the walls were reinforced and the bastions were repaired, the defensive side's advantage was still negligible compared to the offensive side. After sending out a small force to lure the enemy out of the city to fight, but to no avail, the camel men army finally made up their minds. They mobilized almost the entire army and surrounded this Jamek in one fell swoop. Facing the city walls, the catapults lined up in a row and threw polished round stones into the city. This continued for an entire day. All the warriors of the Dragon Clan were suppressed to the point that they could not move. They could only hide in the cat's ear holes that had been built to hide. Under the bombardment of the stone cannons, some of the city walls began to crack and collapse. Brock had no choice but to order some desert kobolds to carry burlap sacks filled with soil and plug the gaps bit by bit. In order to repair the city walls, this also caused the Dragon Clan's army to suffer casualties for the first time. Several desert kobolds who were responsible for filling in the soil were directly hit by the round stones. Even if they were wearing the fanatic armor, they could not avoid death. During this period, the ballistas set up on the city walls also fired a few times at the camel men's position, destroying 1 or 2 catapults. But immediately, more stone cannons aimed at the ballistae and smashed over. The desert kobolds who were operating the ballistae could only cover their heads and flee again, looking for a place to hide. When night fell, perhaps because all the polished round stones had been consumed, the catapults temporarily stopped firing. But the camel men's attack did not stop. Dozens of elemental shamans walked to the front of the formation and summoned the elements at the same time. In order to cooperate with them to cast spells, more camel priests stood behind these elemental shamans and constantly cast buffs on them. For a time, the wind whistled and the rain poured down. The bonfires lit by the desert kobolds on the city walls were blown out and extinguished. Following the storm was snowflakes mixed with hailstones. Under the concerted efforts of several elemental shamans, the bone-chilling cold appeared in the Camel Empire for the first time. Because they received the news in advance, the Camel Men army provided each warrior with rainproof raincoats and cloaks to keep warm. But even so, there were still many camel men who were so cold that their teeth chattered and they shivered incessantly. Some camel men who went to Thick Sturdy Island even suspected that the spellcasters had used some great power to move this battlefield to the extreme north. Compared to them, the defenders of the Dragonborn clan in Jamek were even worse off. Most of the desert kobolds became weak, and some of the battle lizard men even directly triggered their bodies' hibernation function, falling asleep on the spot. They had no choice but to build waterproof huts under the city walls and light a fire for warmth inside. Every once in a while, some desert kobolds and battle lizard men would be sent into the huts to defrost. Only by repeating this cycle could people on the city walls still be able to pick up weapons. Not only that, the sudden drop in temperature also exposed a major flaw of the fanatic armor. Even the young blue dragon and the half-lich Snade, the inventor, did not think of it before. In a low-temperature environment, the nutrient liquid inside the flesh of the fanatic armor would condense. In a situation where the energy supply failed, this biological tissue could not even provide the strength of a tiger and would also shrink and harden. At this time, wearing it could only be described as being trapped in a cocoon. And at this time, the Camel Men army launched a general attack. Brandish the spear, meet the enemy with the giant shield, run with me to victory. The war priests walked into formation and raised the double-headed hammer that they had just become familiar with. Through the divine spell, magnificent voice, their voices could be heard by all the Camel Men soldiers. For the honor of the King of Twin Peaks, the response came one after another, and some of the vanguard soldiers with the seal of divine grace flag on their spears also began to pray silently. The flag handed by the priests emitted light in the dark night, dispelling the tension and coldness in the hearts of the nearby allies. Everything about this war was tilting in the camel men's favor. Chapter 241. Boiling Oil Spell. Under the guidance of the war priests, a torrential downpour of boiling oil fell near the city gate. A circular area with a diameter of about 20 feet was completely covered by the boiling oil. None of the desert kobolds were hit by the oil. Only a few unlucky ones were slightly scalded by the sputtering oil. As the boiling oil spell was a divine spell, the summoned oil could not be ignited. That was why the camel priests did not summon flames to burn down the gate of Jamek. They used another method to knock on the gate. Galloping Rock. A few war priests cast a spell together. Several rocks that weighed about 50 pounds were thrown in the direction that Shunji and the others were pointing at. It was as if they were being launched by a catapult towards the gate that was secured by the defending army. Clang, clang, clang. After a few muffled sounds, the gate of Jamek was finally pierced through by a galloping rock. What followed was a few similar sounds of wood breaking. Some of the Dragonborn clan warriors nearby worked together to lift up logs and place them behind the gate as support. If there were a few more galloping rocks, or if the camel people charged in with their axes, they would not be able to hold on for long. However, it was better than doing nothing. What happened after that was not much different from what the war priests had expected. The camel warriors who were inspired by the divine spell of war were like bulls in heat. They slammed into the gate of the camp. Spears, axes, and even punches and kicks were thrown. In a short while, the reinforced copper gate was pushed down by the camel people. The first to break into this Jamek was a group of double-humped camel people, heavily armored warriors. They were covered in bronze armor from head to toe. They were in groups of 3, and a number of small triangular formations formed a large wedge formation. They quickly rushed into the city. Following behind the heavily armored warriors was a group of single-humped camel people in light armor. Most of them were only wearing leather armor. They held short spears and round shields covered in leather. After breaking through the gate, they went up the stairs to eliminate the guards on the city wall. Regardless of whether they were heavy armor warriors or light armor warriors, the armor on the hunchback people's bodies consciously strengthened the defense of their lower body. They were originally used to being barefoot, but now they were wearing armor strung together with copper plates. Their ankles, knees, and crotch areas were also equipped with special armor. By summarizing the information of the previous battle with the Dragonborn clan, the war priests of the camel people summed up many targeted strategies. In addition to their physiological weakness to the cold, they also made corresponding preparations to deal with close combat. It could be said that the war priests had sufficient confidence in winning this battle. At the same time, they also had a certain level of expectation for the enemy's counterattack. However, when they actually attacked Jamek, they found that the resistance they encountered was significantly different from what they had expected. It could even be said that the desert kobolds and battle lizardmen did not even put up any resistance before they were defeated in a single blow. When the hunchback people rushed forward, they began to retreat. They rarely faced the enemy head-on. Only the unlucky ones who were alone would have the courage to fight the camel warriors to the end. Priest, a double-peak aristocrat in heavy armor, lifted his face guard and ran to the side of the hunchbacked war priest who was frowning in thought. Panting heavily, he said, "Those monsters dug a hole in the ground. We crashed into a house and just happened to see they were retreating." After listening to the double-peak aristocrat's report, the war priest immediately understood. He immediately used the battlefield messaging spell to send this message to the other commanders of the hunchbacked army. "Hurry up and have the shamans explore." A meticulous war priest immediately replied. "Find the elemental shamans closest to you and split up to find the direction of the tunnel. If necessary, directly destroy those tunnels. Don't let those monsters go." Not to mention the exasperated hunchbacks. The warriors of the Dragonborn clan who had escaped from the tunnel had now gathered around their commander. "Your spell?" Brock raised his head and asked. The air was filled with the smell of filth and blood, which made the desert elf who boasted of having a strong wolf feel frightened. "It's best to hurry up. Those hunchbacked war priests have probably seen some clues, Snade lifted the hood of his robe, opened his mouth full of steel teeth, and spat out a mouthful of hot steam. He then interrupted the desert elf's words with a resolute and decisive tone. I can guarantee that they can't do anything about it. Before his voice died away, the summoning circle that the steampunk half-lich operated independently changed. More than 100 ferocious hunchbacks that the Dragonborn clan had captured along the way were firmly tied to standing logs and placed at the altar position in the summoning circle as sacrifices. A thick green mist gushed out from the altar, which combined with the technology similar to the corruption magic commonly used by the mages in the Ashen world. The hunchback sinners who were shrouded could not make a single sound before they turned into shriveled corpses one after another. The logs used to tie the hunchbacks under the activation of the magic circle seemed to come alive and took the initiative to take them deep into the ground. As enough life energy had been extracted, the logs sank very powerfully, and the shriveled corpses were crushed one after another. The souls of the sinners were not wasted either. Red like lightning leaped between the logs that had drilled into the ground, crushing the souls of each sinner that had just dissipated, causing the fragments to gradually decompose and nourish the earth and stones in a magic circle. In a magic circle, the ground that was originally hard had turned into a swamp at this moment. The sound of bones and rocks rubbing against each other could be heard from it. Finally, the flashing runes on the ground suddenly all dimmed. After a loud rumble, a huge crack was torn open in the ground, and a stronger smell of filth than before came out. Then a pair of hands, a head, and a whole body crawled out of the crack. When the bones of the sinners pollute the earth, the rocks and soil reshape their bodies, and hatred and resentment make them transform into one, and then it becomes. Looking at his creation with satisfaction, the half-lich's voice turned into an aria. Earth Corpse. Being called by the name, the Earth Corpse immediately bent down to look at its creator. Because of the addition, the size of the Earth Corpse was far beyond its peers, and even the Storm Giant could not compare to it. Endless soil and earth elements turned into its bones and muscles, just like a disaster born from the earth itself. It roared, as if it wanted to resist, and there was a certain commotion among the warriors of the Dragon clan nearby. However, Snader picked up a rune from the magic array and immediately gave up on the idea. Your target is there, the half-lich stated in a monotonous voice. Your former compatriots are there. The word compatriots stimulated the undead that was transformed from a hunchback sinner. The earth corpse strode and ran. As it passed, the earth produced ripples and caused unnatural vibrations. Just a little bit of the impact, and some desert kobold were shaken to the ground. Chapter 242. What the hell is that? The moment they saw the earth corpse, all the camel people felt a chill from the bottom of their hearts. It was as tall as dozens of people, basically made up of yellow bones, brown soil, gray rocks, and a few pieces of rotten flesh. The smell of decay and death in the breeze was nauseating, making people feel a burning sensation in their throat and their stomachs churning. The battlefield was full of people who thirsted for violence and destruction, and the thrill of fear, anger, and bloodthirst was born. A few elemental shamans had enough rest. The spell to change the weather was tiring, but they still wanted to destroy the terrible and wrong existence in front of them as soon as possible. The dead thing that was waving its tree-trunk-sized fist was itself a blasphemy to nature. The most violent and deadly elements, such as fire and lightning, were first summoned to attack the earth corpse. However, the latter was not stupid. The soul of a camel sinner gave it a very cunning character. Relying on its agility that did not match its body size, the corpse of the earth jumped up with all its might and landed behind a piece of basalt, using the rock as its shield. The elemental shaman's attacks fell on the basalt, making stone chips rustle, but the real target did not suffer much damage. The huge undead touched the rock in front of it, and then the stone sculpting spell was activated, and its body gradually merged into the rock. With a rumble, the rock that was attached to the earth corpse rolled up and rushed straight to the camel army's formation. Many soldiers were still in Jamahel and had not had time to withdraw, and only the camel emperor stayed behind to guard. The super-large rock ball rushed to them with unstoppable force, crushing everything in its way. Trees, deer, firewood, and the emperor's guards who overestimated themselves. How dare you? Faced with the incoming crisis, the hunchback emperor immediately chose to avoid it. However, after he was escorted to a high ground by the Twin Peak nobles and their servants, his eyes almost popped out of their sockets when he saw the miserable state of the camp. Grabbing a spear from the guard beside him, the camel emperor aimed at the rock ball where the earth corpse was hiding, twisted his waist and bent his knees, and threw the spear. As the officiant of the Double Peak Temple, although he did not show it often, he was actually a high-level priest of the camel god. In addition to the fact that he was a direct descendant of the camel god, the divine power that he could mobilize actually far surpassed that of ordinary camel god priests. The flying spear tore through the air, and the huge rock ball was unavoidable. Divine power lingered on the spear, and after coming into contact with the dark aura emitted by the corpse on the ground, a violent explosion occurred. Starting from the point where the spear was nailed, the cracks instantly spread all over the rock ball. A cracking sound suddenly sounded, and the earth corpse staggered out of the rock that it was attached to and issued a threatening roar in the direction of the person who gave it a heavy blow. This skeleton monster must be the backup plan of the previous monsters. Since they did not know the name of the corpse on the ground, the camel priests simply named it Skeleton Monster. At the same time, they were actively looking for a way to deal with it. The divine power seems to be very harmful to it. What happened next was a classic example of an instant slap in the face. The earth corpse that was forced to fall out of the rock ball stretched out its bony claws, and the stone sculpting spell was activated again. The scattered rock fragments on the ground were like magnets, attracting together to form a giant basalt rod. The earth corpse picked up the giant rod, waved its hand, and swept away a group of camel warriors that were surrounding it. Then it struck again. Within a few breaths, at least a dozen camel warriors were knocked down. A few unfortunate ones died on the spot, and most of them were injured. 4 ordinary undead creatures. The priests were indeed their nemesis, and the divine power was a kind of poison that could penetrate their intestines. But the earth corpse was different, because its body and soul were protected by the tainted earth element. Even if it was baptized by the divine power, it could still hold on for a while. Unless these priests could mobilize the holy power of virtue, like Sacred Samurai Johnson, they could defeat the evil of the earth corpse in one fell swoop. But the camel priests obviously did not have that ability. After all, the god they worshipped was not good at it. The matter of the earth should still be handed over to the earth to solve. Seeing that the earth's corpses began to wreak havoc, an old elemental shaman walked out from the shadow behind the camel emperor and said with a frosty voice, "Caesar, wait a moment." "Master." The camel emperor bowed his head and was extremely respectful. "Thank you for your help. I will personally bless you." The blessing here was not an ordinary word of courtesy. It was a kind of divine power that the priests used to bless themselves or others by praying to the gods. For the mages, the blessing could increase the success rate of casting spells and enhance the casting focus. For the warriors, the blessing could make their attacks more accurate and their defense more comprehensive. In short, it was a divine power that could improve the luck attribute of the recipient. Moreover, any divine power that involved fate and luck would consume more divine power of the priests. Even though the camel emperor was a descendant of the gods, he had to pray for about 10 days after casting the blessing for others. At the same time, he had to adhere to fasting and bathing. Most of the time, he was even unwilling to continue to cast the blessing for himself. But at this time, he was willing to condescend for an elemental shaman. It showed how much respect this old camel had. "Thank you for your kindness," the camel shaman said in a reserved manner, and at the same time, he began to summon the elements. As one of the few remaining shaman masters in the empire, this old camel man had always served as the consecrator of the Double Peak Temple. His true strength was not inferior to that of the first elemental shaman of the Camel Men, the warlord Girsan. Even in some areas of the shaman's way, the summoning of the earth element, he had explored much more than Girsan. And it was precisely because of this that the old camel was respectfully called Wrath of the Earth by other shamans. Wrath of the Earth slowly took 2 steps forward. He suddenly raised his hands above his head and began to chant loudly. The transition between stillness and movement showed the situation of the earth from calmness to restlessness. And this situation made any onlookers feel a throbbing from the bottom of their hearts. The corpse of the earth, who was waving a giant basalt club to attack the camel army, felt it the most deeply. Its eyes were fixed on the highland, but did not make any unnecessary sounds such as roaring. Instead, it rushed over with its long legs. The old hunchback who was reciting the shaman's incantation gave him a very bad feeling. The earth element that he could control like it was his own arm seemed to be intercepted by some existence that had a stronger affinity with him and was forcibly separated from him. This elemental shaman is a bit strong. Standing on a nearby high hill, the Demolic felt the elemental fluctuations caused by the casting of the wrath of the earth. His head directly turned 180 degrees and said to Brock, "You have to help that corpse of the earth." A few desert kobolds who stood closer were startled by Snade's head turn. Brock, on the other hand, had no time to pay attention to the trick of the steampunk Demolic. He was using the unique method of the speech sorcerer to feel the vibration from the earth. "I'm afraid it's not enough to rely on these warriors of the Dragonborn clan." Before his voice died away, the ground trembled. His Excellency Pasha said that when you come this time, you will have a final weapon in your hand. "I'm afraid the corpse of the earth is not worthy of the title of final weapon." As Brock said, the corpse of the earth was indeed just a cover. The purpose of its creation was to let the camel priest desperately consume a wave of divine spells, thereby weakening the camel god that the camel priest worshipped. "Well, I can't lie to you." The steampunk Demolic shrugged like a human and took out 2 boxes from the space equipment. "These are the antidotes made by Mr. Paru, divided among the warriors, and each of them will take a small packet." Antidotes. Brock immediately thought of something. On the battlefield in the distance, the corpse of the earth, which had been weakened by the loss of the earth element, knelt down. Several giant earth elemental puppets, summoned by the camel shaman's wrath of the earth, surrounded it and beat the undead creature that had desecrated nature. Holding the totem staff in one hand and maintaining the focus of casting, the old camel took a deep breath. A few apprentices who were quite observant hurried forward and helped him stand up. "Fortunately, I didn't disappoint you." Sui Xiong turned his head and said to the hunchback emperor who had blessed him. Even with the blessing of the divine spell, releasing several large-scale shaman spells in succession still put a certain burden on his aging body. "Wait for a while. Let the warriors collect the monster's fragments and burn them together to prevent future troubles." "Master, please rest assured." The camel emperor immediately expressed his understanding. At the same time, he asked his attendants to quickly inform all the war priests to mobilize manpower and ordered others to hurry up and prepare the ignition materials for the burning. At this time, a terrible crash was heard, and everyone felt that their internal organs had been shocked. When they looked carefully, it turned out that the giant earth elemental puppet had smashed the skeleton monster's pelvis, causing its upper body to be separated from its lower body. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. The terrible monster was now lying on the ground, waving its 2 arms around, trying to use its fingers to hook the giant basalt club to fight back. However, its fingers were severely fractured, and its ligaments had been damaged. The giant earth elemental puppet's beating continued, and the corpse of the earth was pressed against the ground and rubbed against it. First, its 2 arms were torn off at the elbow, then a large area of the bones in the torso collapsed and peeled off. Finally, its skull was also smashed into powder by a powerful hammer. Not long ago, the monster was still killing everywhere. Now, only piles of rocks, huge broken bones, and ashes were left on the ground. The lifeless, smoking ligaments were still wrapped around it, and the ashes and ashes were floating with the wind. After finishing the work, the giant earth elemental puppet bowed to the summoner and returned to the elemental plane. The camel warriors gathered and stared at the devastation on the ground and carefully searched. The order they received was, "Do not leave a piece of broken bones on the ground." In order to complete this task, the elemental shamans who were originally going to search for the traces of the Dragonborn clan also withdrew to assist the warriors and burned the pieces of the Earth's corpse on the spot. Unfortunately, Snader, who was watching the scene from a distance, said again, "After being contaminated, it can't be used as a casting material." He was referring to the camel people gathered together. Chapter 243. The skull of a fish monster was hanging behind the bar, and the tavern owner and bartender was wiping off the spilled ale. At this time, a strange hunchback walked into the tavern. Fishbone Tavern usually didn't have any strangers, but today, the owner didn't recognize the visitor, which was rare. Of course, he couldn't remember the names of every customer, but he could always remember the faces of some of his regular customers. Even so, he didn't really care who was who, as long as they could afford a drink and pay. That was enough. There were no windows in the tavern, and only a few torches flickered dimly. A few wooden tables and stools were scattered around. The owner never thought of putting them in a specific shape, because the customers always dragged the tables and chairs around and sat wherever they wanted. The stranger threw a steel coin on the bar, and the sound was very crisp. Then he asked, "What is the most expensive wine here?" The quality was not bad. The owner just checked and concluded, so his attitude was much warmer. Of course, it is the specialty wine of the Big Oasis. It is said that the priests of the King of Twin Peaks invented the recipe, and is brewed from, no, not the kind of wine that the priests like. The young hunchback wrinkled his nose. The owner of Fishbone Tavern shrugged. Different hunchbacks always had a variety of strange hobbies for wine. He'd seen a few customers arguing over whether beer or malt whiskey was better or worse. They had even gotten into a fight. If the guest in front of him didn't like wine, he wouldn't be surprised. How about malt whiskey? The new goods just arrived yesterday, and a lot of them have been sold. Many customers said that it tastes good. That's it. The strange hunchback slammed the bar table heavily, causing the nut skins, cores, and dust on the table to jump and shake. The owner of the bar cleaned the garbage on the table once a month. Anyway, few customers who came to drink cared about whether the bar was clean or not. Some hunchbacks even thought that this was the specialty of Fishbone Tavern. A hunchback with twin humps on his back who looked more like a merchant than a noble turned around and looked at the stranger. He was a regular here and loved wine. "Do you mind telling me why you don't like priest's special drink?" "I don't have any prejudice against wine, sir. I'm just a little worried." The young hunchback extended a hand to the merchant, ignoring the fact that the merchant was ignoring him. He approached the merchant and said, "My name is Keys. I'm an explorer who has traveled extensively. The priests have been very busy recently. I just don't want to see them focusing on making wine." The owner of Fishbone seemed to be very interested in the story behind these words. He pretended to wipe the bar nonchalantly and leaned over. The regulars of Twin Peaks didn't care about his actions. It was as if they didn't know that the owner and bartender of this bar had just cleaned the bar a few days ago. As a merchant, the two-hump camel man was very interested in the gossip about the goods. "Oh," he dragged out his question. "How do you say this?" 5 or 6 days ago, they did follow the army to clear out the monsters, but it is said that they made good progress. They should be back in 2 days. The young hunchback named Keys, who claimed to be an explorer, lowered his voice again. This time, he almost mouthed the news he knew. "Pestilence." Then he looked around vigilantly. "I heard that the army has been infected with the plague, and the priests of the camel god can't do anything about it. So, I don't want them to spend their energy on the old special drink at this time. At the same time, for health reasons, it's better not to drink the wine that they make themselves." The customers at the bar counter who were shocked by this news widened their eyes. Just as they were about to ask in detail to confirm it, the sound of brass drums came from outside the Fishbone Tavern. It was the drumbeat that was used to clear the streets when the army returned after returning from battle. The two-humped merchant glanced at keys beside him, then got up and walked out. After a while, he walked back and was about to pick up his wine glass and drink a mouthful of wine to calm himself down. As if he thought of something, he immediately pushed the wine glass inside the bar in disgust. "Give me a glass of malt whiskey." In a short while, almost all the customers who were drinking wine had changed the contents of their glasses to other alcoholic drinks. For the first time, the owner of the bar also piled up wine glasses in the sink waiting to be washed. Like the merchants who had just run to the street to watch, they could not forget the stumbling hunchback soldiers and the disgusting pus traces on their bodies that could not be completely covered with clothes. After the fragments of the Earth's corpse were burned, the doom of the undead, which was concocted by Pallet and blended by Snade, completely spread out. This new type of plague, which was a combination of voodoo and undead curse, instantly infected most of the hunchbacks present. Only some elemental shamans, who relied on the spirit of elements to summon fire elements to cleanse themselves, were lucky enough to escape. As for the rest of the hunchbacks, no matter whether they were two-humped nobles or single-humped warriors, none of them were spared. The elemental shaman's method of restraining the doom of the undead could not be used on ordinary hunchbacks. Only the priests of the camel god could repeatedly release healing divine spells to eradicate the source of the plague in their bodies. Although there was no distinction between those who were infected with the plague, there was a difference in the order of treatment. For example, the camel emperor and the priests of the camel god saved themselves first, followed by the war priests, who did not have the ability to heal, and the two-humped nobles. As for the single-humped camel people, who had the highest number of infected people, they were the last to be rescued. Due to the proliferation of the disease, their bodies had ulcerated to varying degrees. Pale yellow pus was constantly oozing out and hanging on the surface of their wounds. As for the prevention of the plague, the hunchbacks did not have any precedents to follow, so naturally, no one proposed measures such as epidemic prevention and quarantine. The priests of the camel god used all their skills and continuously released divine spells to prevent the two-humped nobles who had just been cured from being infected a second time. Some of the single-humped camel men could not be treated in time because of this and could only use their physique to restrain the outbreak of the disease. The original plan to wipe out the monsters that had wreaked havoc in the Camel Empire in one fell swoop was completely disrupted. The Camel army quickly marched back to the big oasis at the cost of their lives, so that the priests who stayed behind could also participate in the control of the plague. But to be honest, the overall physique of the camel race was really excellent. In addition, with the permission of the young blue dragon, Brock did not lead the warriors of the Dragonborn clan to chase after them. The camel army that was infected with the doom of the undead had a loss rate of less than 30%. Many of the single-humped camel men insisted on walking back to the big oasis, and this was exactly what Keys wanted. The more sources of the plague, the more hunchbacks could be infected. The more hunchbacks would need to be treated by the priests, and the more power of the camel god would be consumed. The failure of the war, coupled with the news spread by the young blue dragon who had transformed into a hunchback, could also play the role of weakening their faith. With two approaches at the same time, it would naturally be twice as easy to deal with them. Chapter 244. Most of the time, the Emperor of the Camel people dealt with affairs in this small and cramped room. Thousands of scrolls were piled up on the table and floor, which was completely different from the magnificent main hall. In front of him was a large chair that did not match the size of the room. At this moment, the ruler of the Camel People Empire was just pacing back and forth in front of the awkward chair, refusing to sit on it. Someone, the Emperor of the Camel People, seemed to have thought of something and hurriedly asked his attendant to come in. "Go and prepare the holy oil and the sacrifice." An old camel attendant came in from outside the door and immediately left. He knew where to send the things. There were 3 doors in this office, 2 of which were visible to everyone. One was the door that the attendant had just come in, and the other was connected to the corridor and the stairs, which led directly to Caesar's bedroom. Behind the third door was a secret passage that led to the other side of the double-peaked temple. Originally, 6 people knew about the existence of the secret passage, 5 of whom were the workers who built the passage, but unfortunately, they had already died in accidents. After putting on the robe required for the audience ceremony, the emperor of the camel people, oh no, he should be called the archbishop of the camel god now, turned his head and looked at the pile of parchments on the table again, which were full of reports on the outbreak of the plague. He took a deep breath and pushed the door of the secret passage open. Of course, he knew how serious the plague was at this time in the large oasis. Even if the mortality rate of the plague was not high, if the infection was not treated in time, the scene of festering and dripping pus was still enough to make every patient have a mental breakdown. At present, the only proven effective treatment method was the healing magic performed by the camel god priests. However, as mortals, after all, they needed to rest and pray to replenish their magic. In the face of the spreading speed of the plague, their efforts seemed to be a drop in the bucket. Coming to the temple where the camel god lived, he smeared the holy oil and offered the sacrifice. Then he poured the fresh blood of the taboo sheep into the copper cauldron in front of him, and then knelt in the dreamy desert in the temple, prostrating himself on the ground. The spirit of the great ancestors, the bearer of the only 2 continents in the world, the guide of the camel men, the ruler of the desert, the honorable king of the Twin Peaks, your most loyal servant greets you. The camel man's lower lip touched the ground to show his inferiority. The empire is facing an unprecedented crisis. I hope you can help me to solve the current predicament. In the desert illusion at the center of the hall, a camel that seemed to be carved out of crystal slowly rose from the ground. My descendants, his voice was like an ancient well, without any ripples. Quickly gather all the patients together. I will purify them and eliminate the plague. The purification promised by the camel god was really to eliminate the plague, not to destroy humanity. In fact, that was all he could do. As the god of the race, the camel god could not ignore the camel people's pleas to be saved, nor could he free them without trying to help them. It was a betrayal of the faith system of the multiverse, and he did not even dare to imagine the consequences. But not everyone could understand such a God's secret. At this time, the camel people's oasis was filled with fear, and with a little guidance from someone with intentions, it was not surprising that suspicion and jealousy were born. Have you heard? What's the matter? The priests gathered all the infected people together and prepared a lot of firewood at the same time. What nonsense are you talking about? Is it true? Why are there so few of the Twin Peaks nobles infected, and why can they be treated the fastest after they get sick? In the Temple of the Twin Peaks, the Camel Emperor's face was gloomy. The riots and demonstrations in the past few days had made his heart, which he thought was still young, a little tired. The attendants, wrapped in white robes, flocked to bring back the news from the priests, and then quickly left, taking handwritten orders signed by Caesar himself. They're like white maggots walking through the intestines. He did not know why such a metaphor suddenly appeared in his mind, and it made him feel a little scared. Uneasiness gushed out like a flood that opened the floodgates, and his limbs and bones became cold. Everything will be fine. The Camel Emperor comforted himself. Just now, the priests had sent news that with the cooperation of the Twin Peaks nobles and the elemental shamans, they had forcibly gathered all the infected camels and were now doing the final screening to prevent any missing infected. Just after today, at the same time, all the camel priests were busy. Even the war priests who had gone through the profession change and lost the ability to use healing divine spells were involved, helping their colleagues manage the gathered patients and soothing their emotions. The elemental shamans, on the other hand, led squads composed entirely of twin-hump camels. According to the oracle of the Twin-Hump King, they searched everywhere for infected people who might have been hidden by their families and moved them to an isolated camp without resorting to force. When all the preparatory work was done, the camel god would personally use his divine power to eliminate every possible source of the plague and solve the plague from its roots. As for the rumors and slanders, they would naturally be dispelled by then. When a repeated screening was completed, the last infected person was transferred to the isolated camp, and there were about 30,000 camels gathered in the entire camp. Except for a few managers, the rest were patients, and among these patients, the single-humped camels, who had slightly weaker physiques, accounted for 90%. Standing on the temporary wall, a war priest looked pitifully at the infected lying on the ground and could not help but sigh. What a terrible war! Feeling the questioning gazes of the other war priests around him, he quickly changed his words. I mean the abominable enemies. After dealing with these, we must wipe out those monsters. At this moment, the monsters that made the war priests gnash their teeth in hatred. The army of the Dragonborn clan, led by the desert elf Blatch, and the steampunk half-liches that brought plague disaster to the camels, were also in the large oasis, and they were very close to them. Because of the plague, a camel people's farm was temporarily abandoned by the farm owner. After traveling day and night and sneaking all the way here, the Dragon family clan was hiding here, quietly waiting for an opportunity. Compared to the camels, the kobold's physique was indeed very ordinary. Even if they had taken the antidote prepared by the ogre shaman Puru immediately, after the outbreak of the plague, more than a dozen desert kobolds fell ill one after another. Fortunately, Snade knew the basic formula of the potion. Boil the willow bark with vinegar and add some Artemisia annua extract. Concentrate it and drink it directly. In short, increasing the intake of the potion would allow the kobolds to survive the plague. Of course, a supreme warrior like Brock did not need to do this. But after discovering the strange effect of the willow bark to relieve headaches, this desert elf had developed the habit of chewing some willow bark when he had nothing to do. When we do it, spitting out the willow bark that had been chewed until it was dry, Brock frowned at the unique bitter taste in his mouth. Good medicine was bitter, the consistent characteristic of Paru's formula. I heard the complaints of the people of the camels. They are boiling. As a warlock who was proficient in the art of sound, if he wanted, Brock could capture any conversation within a radius of tens of pale sand from the wind. In the past 2 days, the repeated complaints and curses directed at the two-peak nobles and priests had even allowed him to learn some of the dialect of the camels. There was no doubt that at this time, the situation of all the infected people who had been taken away had been affecting the hearts of their relatives and friends, and most of them were single-peak camels. Because of the plague, the cornerstone of the camel empire's rule, the single-peak and double-peak duel system, had suffered a great blow. Between the two-peak camels and single-peak camels, a huge gap had been torn in the social relationship. It was not an exaggeration to say that if the army of the Dragonborn clan only attacked the two-peak nobles and gave the formula of the antidote to the single-peak camels, the single-peak camels might even ignore the two-peak camels who were attacked. It will be your turn soon. Hearing Brock's question, Snader manipulated the mechanical prosthesis to make a gesture. Electric sparks flashed, and he also got some latest news. It's best to start preparing now, no, immediately. The steampunk half-lich was just contacting Keys. To be more precise, he was communicating with Keys on the Leviathan in real time through a communication technology called radio that was newly invented by the young Blue Dragon. Through specific electric sparks to send, receive, and then translate the information according to the shared code in advance. Although such a communication method had restrictions, such as the inability to communicate across planes, it avoided the risk of the magic communication being intercepted by the camel god. Even if the camel god also received those signals, without the corresponding codebook, he would still not be able to know the specific content. Aimed at the target, ready to throw. After a difficult climb, with the help of magic, psionic power, and the reconstituted jet thrusters, the Leviathan finally broke through the stratosphere of the island world and little by little reached the middle of the atmospheric ionosphere. In order to reduce the load on themselves, all the desert kobold pilots did not board the ship before takeoff, leaving only the young Blue Dragon to coordinate with the Leviathan in the way of spiritual communication. Together, they overcame a series of difficulties and completed the hovering. Using the Alamaka's bucket of waste previously seized from the boat of the Scorching Sun of the Obsidian Council, Keyes paid with his own money and the sole prism that he did not even have the chance to use to obtain a large amount of tungsten metal from the elemental plane of Earth. In order to process this metal with an extremely high melting point, he even personally transformed into a dragon and used the blazing dragon's breath to make 10 tungsten rods, about 20 feet long and only 2 to 3 feet in diameter. Each tungsten rod weighed about 10 tons. This weapon, called the God's Cane, in the memory of Keyes' previous life, was a gift that he had carefully prepared for the camel god. The target of all the tungsten rods was the double-peaked temple where the camel god lived. Without the protection of the divine kingdom, the gods walking in the world were sometimes like this. With a certain degree of preparation, they were no different from fixed targets. He assisted the Leviathan to calibrate the target again, loosened the suspending muscles that bound the tungsten rods, and left the rest to gravity. Chapter 245. It was night, and the moon rose. At this moment, it was full and bright, hanging high in the clear night sky dotted with stars. Under the gentle moonlight, the peak where the double-peaked temple was located stretched to the sky. During the day, the sun would reflect the purple and rusty colors on the granite peak. However, under the moonlight, they all transformed into tall and dark spots. On the west side of the mountain range was the largest double-peaked camel settlement and a large oasis. The canopy of giant oak and linden trees covered the sky and stretched from the foot of the mountain to the side of the settlement. On the east side was a lush grassland. It was a land full of pastures, farms, and deep irrigation wells. A large number of single-peak camel people worked and lived there. The double-peak temple was located halfway up the mountain. A large piece of the fortress-like rock mass at the top of the mountain had been hacked off. It was very flat. Some places had gaps caused by hacking and chiseling. In some places, there were even some traces of words that seemed to have been used in ancient human kingdoms. However, only a few people had mentioned this to the owner of this place. The others were either not brave enough or not bold enough. The owner of this place, needless to say, was naturally the king of Twin Peaks who lived in the double-peaked temple. Recently, the camel god had not been living well. It could even be said that it was terrible. He, who had been comprehending the priesthood of the war domain little by little, was disturbed by the sudden war. He hastily got involved in a dangerous war and tasted the bitter fruit of failure immediately. Not only that, but a plague that was more fatal than the decline of divinity brought about by failure, which affected the foundation of faith, swept through the entire large oasis. He could only continuously provide the priests under him with divine power for healing. However, the speed of recovery was not as fast as the speed of infection. The priests were consuming divine power at an extremely fast rate. In the end, he had no choice but to rely on his descendants, the camel emperor who was in charge of the secular world of the camel empire, to gather all the infected people. He would then personally consume a large amount of divine power accumulated in one go to completely eradicate the source of the plague. Only then could he stop the damage in time. However, who would have thought that rumors would spread all over the place? The infected single-peak camel people would actually make wild guesses about the camel god's intentions. They thought that the double-peak nobles, camel god priests, elemental shamans, and other important people of the empire were preparing to stop the spread of the plague with a bloody massacre. He had been wronged. He had been greatly wronged. Honestly speaking, the camel god had thought of this before, but considering the possible consequences, he had to abandon this plan completely and choose a stupid method that would weaken him in a short period of time to solve the problem. However, after today, all the recovered camel men would understand that God had not given up on them. Everything would get better and return to the right track. On the flat top of the rocky hill, a tall tower made of white stones and dark gray mortar rose from the ground. It was tall and majestic, reaching straight into the clouds. Under the moonlight, it shone like a lighthouse. At the bottom of the tower, there was an outer courtyard surrounded by a low wall. Many single-humped camel people who had been infected with the plague but had not been treated in time were crowded here. There were as many as 20,000 of them, completely occupying the spacious platform. They were either sitting or lying down, but they were all lifeless. However, on the top of the mountain, the tower was the master of everything. Although it was also hurriedly set up by the elemental shamans, it was responsible for assisting the camel god in healing with divine spells. It could be said that it was the most important thing. It's time. The camel priest who had been in charge of looking after the water clock stood up. Compared with his joyful face, a war priest beside him looked a little fanatical. The great double-peak king is about to arrive. Golden light gushed out from the double-peak temple halfway up the mountain and shone straight on the high tower at the top of the platform. Whether it was the ordinary camel priests or the war priests who had recently changed their profession, they all stood up straight with solemn expressions. Hymns began to sound. Mighty king, you came from the desert and led the camel people straight without any hindrance. Mighty king, under your protection, the empire will prosper for all eternity. With this desolate, powerful, and highly infectious song, the camel people who had been infected with the plague also seemed to be injected with some vitality. Many camel people spontaneously knelt on the ground and worshipped the tower that had been plated with a layer. A double-humped camel, shining like a diamond, appeared at the top of the tower and slowly rose into the sky. Its dazzling light illuminated the night sky, making it as bright as day. Those who believe in me, I will save them. The camel god's voice rang in everyone's ears on the top of the platform. Then, like a silver bottle suddenly breaking, the huge, diamond-like shadow of the double-humped camel turned into liquid, turned into stars, and turned into seeds called hope, sprinkled to every sick camel person. A huge amount of divine power, which had been accumulated for nearly 100 years, was used up by the camel god in one go to eliminate the source of the plague in every sick person to prevent future trouble. Where there is loss, there is gain. His mind returned to the temple, and the camel god, whose body seemed to have been hollowed out, comforted himself. The more than 20,000 camel people who were saved this time would presumably have stronger faith and would certainly provide him with more power of faith in the future. In the long run, the camel god could even make a small profit. However, like a prophecy, the gain came a little too quickly. With the release of divine power, not only did the shadow of the diamond camel dissipate, but the tower that had been plated with golden light also faded. The darkness of the night once again shrouded the top of the mountain. One after another, joyful shouts and sobs began to erupt. The camel god's pastors, who had been prepared, immediately ordered people to light more bonfires, wanting to take advantage of the situation to give a sermon. However, at this time, a little light suddenly lit up in the sky. Could it be that the camel god's grace has not been exhausted? Or perhaps it's the second reward? Many of the camel people present had similar doubts in their hearts. They were guessing what this late gift was. It shouldn't be. The camel god's pastors knew very well that they could feel that the great double-humped king had left. What is that? The light was getting more and more dazzling, especially with the dark night sky as the background. However, many people would rather squint their eyes to see the strange gift that fell from the sky. 1 speck, 2 specks, 3 specks, a total of 10 specks of light formed a straight line in the sky and fell straight down. Within a few breaths, there was a sudden shriek, and the light spots that formed a string seemed to have deviated from their position. They fell straight toward the double-humped temple halfway up the mountain. Oh no! A war priest suddenly realized that it might be an attack from some kind of weapon. Unfortunately, it was too late. Due to the high melting point, the friction with the air when it passed through the ionosphere, stratosphere, and troposphere did not cause any loss in weight of the tungsten rod. Its small cross-section and long body shape also reduced the impact of air resistance on its speed. Gravity produced acceleration, and the super-long falling distance allowed the speed of the tungsten rod to reach an astonishing level. Coupled with its own huge mass, it gave each tungsten rod a huge kinetic energy. Although there was no way to release the tungsten rod from the warm layer above the ionosphere, due to the limit of Leviathan's liftoff, 10 tungsten rods were released at the same time. To a certain extent, the quantity made up for the lack of power of this weakened version of the god's cane. The space-based weapons that were close to the yield of several tactical peace warheads directly wiped out the double-humped temple from the island world. The remaining waves also completely wiped out the camel gods' pastors, elemental shamans, double-humped nobles, and more than 20,000 people who had just recovered from the plague. What a gift! What a gift that could enlighten even the deaf. What a terrifying gift! In a small farm far to the east of the large oasis, the hidden Dragonborn clan army also felt the shock. All the houses collapsed. Even the Demolik, who thought he had seen a lot, could not help but secretly click his tongue. This power, 10 meteor storms are just like this. No, 10 meteor storms can't be compared to this. Having hesitated for many years in the lower plane, Snade had seen the scene of the demons releasing meteor storms. As the top evocation spell, meteor storms only made a deep pit when they hit the ground. But from the scene from the spying eye that had been destroyed because it was a little closer, the Demolik saw the light and shadow of the last magma in the depths of the Earth's core. The spying eye was made of magic, and what it saw was really using magic to detect. This meant that the light and shadow of the magma was not caused by an explosion, but real magma. In other words, Keys only used one blow to directly penetrate this land, which was extremely terrifying. And the camel god, who had experienced this great horror, was already extremely weak at this time. Of course, he would not die so easily. As a god, even if he was a primitive and young god, his ability was far beyond what ordinary people could guess. But after using all his strength to block the first bombardment of the tungsten rod, he was unable to resist. The remaining 9 tungsten rods that followed closely nailed him into the depths of the earth. As for abilities such as spells and teleportation, before the tungsten rods fell, he could still divide his mind to use his divine power to simulate, but after being bombarded twice, his thinking ability was close to crashing. In addition, his divinity level was 0, and he had no avatar to rely on, so he could only rely on his hidden divine body to resist. In the end, of course, he was seriously injured, and the flame of his divinity was almost extinguished. The camel god's divine body turned into minced meat and scattered all over the rock wall of the deep crevice. Every piece of flesh was desperately condensing together, but he had no time to care about this. His divine body was only left with his head, a small half of his body, and an arm. He also used the remaining divine power to condense a spear and held it in his palm. It was impossible for the person who planned this attack not to pursue the victory, but to leave a god as his enemy. And this was the truth. Chapter 246. As soon as Keys stepped into the abyss, he felt like he was being targeted by a ferocious beast. A cornered beast will still fight. The young blue dragon frowned. But that's all. He was encouraging himself, as well as stating the truth, especially when he saw the hunchback god who was ready to fight back. He could not help but notice the hunchback god's miserable state. "You're not from this world." Of course, the hunchback god had noticed Keys. As he was close enough, he could clearly sense that something was wrong with Keys. "Why do you want to be my enemy? Or should I say, who told you to do this?" "I'm willing to," just as this god was about to use the word delay and use the empty guarantee to buy some time for himself, the foreign invaders in front of him launched an attack and suppressed the god. Despicable scum. A pale yellow halo appeared on the hunchback god's body. It was the most powerful attack of the Spirit Extinguisher leader under the half-lich Keys. The Spirit Extinguisher leader who was brought here by Keys had sacrificed himself to curse the god he hated. The hunchback god, who was already severely injured, was even worse now. His remaining divine power was completely messed up. The light on his broken body, which symbolized the god's extraordinariness, was flickering. The divine power weapon that was hidden in his hand behind his back had collapsed. Whoosh! The king of Twin Peaks, whose eyes were filled with blood, opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of divine blood with golden light spots. The blood turned into a thick red mist after leaving his body and blocked the bottom of the abyss. Immediately, he slapped the ground with his palm and flew out of the abyss with the momentum of the recoil. The Spirit Extinguisher Leader's attack had indeed caused some negative effects on the Hunchback God. However, as long as he had time to breathe, he could still get rid of the negative effects on his body and fight back. Moreover, the divine power in the mouthful of blood that he had spat out earlier would be ignited by the divine power if any mortal came into contact with it. It was fatal to an ordinary mortal. Judging from the method that the otherworldly invader used to injure him, he seemed to have used some extremely powerful spell. Generally speaking, most mortals who dared or attempted to attack gods were spellcasters. The physique of most spellcasters was pitifully low. Their bodies were burned by the flames used to forge the divinity. Even if they could escape in the end, it would take a lot of effort. What he lacked the most at the moment was time. However, the young blue dragon was also in a hurry. The vigorous dragon roar pierced through the red mist formed by the divine blood. Keys transformed into his dragon form, spread his dragon wings, and flew out. He could feel an inexplicable flame burning fiercely beneath his scales and within his limbs and bones. If he hadn't been modified by Minerva's skull not long ago, which had evolved his passive adaptive ability into an active adaptive ability, Keys would have fallen into a deep sleep to adapt to this state the moment the foreign flame entered his body. The consequences of that would undoubtedly be a complete loss. However, even though the young blue dragon had avoided the most unfavorable situation, he still had no time to waste. Ending the battle quickly was Keys's only choice. With a rumble, the gigantic head of the Megalosaurus collided with the camel god, pushing him against the rock wall of the deep ravine. There was a series of loud noises. The remaining body of the god was like a gemstone embedded in a ring, half buried in the cobweb-like gravel. Spell maximum, plunder spell. The young blue dragon released a top-level defensive spell. In order to cast this spell in an instant, he had even prepared for an entire day in advance. There would always be a reward for one's efforts. This principle was applicable everywhere. As soon as the plunder spell was used, it immediately destroyed the camel god's attempt to escape by merging into the rock. The spell effect that he had simulated with divine power, similar to Keys's rock-walking spell, was immediately taken away by Keys. The claws of the Megalosaurus instantly merged into the rock, and it carried out a grappling attack on the camel god. The god, who was firmly controlled, mustered up his remaining strength, clenched his remaining fist, and hammered Keys's chest. The scales instantly burst open. Even though he had used his force field ability to deflect part of the force, a large area of Keys's chest still collapsed. Keys's super electromagnetic gun. Enduring the pain, the young blue dragon used one of his trump cards. An electromagnetic shell wrapped in lightning shot out from his mouth and smashed the camel god's skull. This time, it was the god's turn to cry out in pain. Mind Blast. The second trump card was revealed. While the camel god's head was injured, Keys pushed his mind power to the peak and directly let it explode in his opponent's brain. He immediately fell into a temporary state of dizziness. Time waited for no man. The young blue dragon opened his huge mouth and began to gnaw at the remains of the camel god with all his might. In reality, Keys himself did not know how to kill a god. However, at the last moment of absorbing Minerva's skull, the modified adaptive ability came into play and digested a lot of divine power. For a primitive god like the camel god, with a divine persona level of 0, its essence was an ancestral spirit that was completely composed of divine power. Therefore, he boldly guessed that if he wanted to completely eradicate this god, he would still have to devour it at the critical moment. He had to make bold assumptions and carefully verify them. After devouring a small part of the camel god's body, Keys immediately realized that his adaptive ability had come into effect again. His body underwent a positive evolution, and the divine power became the energy that sustained the evolution. With the adaptive ability, the divine power seemed to have become a perfect tonic. Whether it was his body or his soul, the young blue dragon was continuously nourished. In terms of his body, his smashed chest healed rapidly, and his bones and muscles began to regenerate at an accelerated rate. In terms of the soul, when a god faced a mortal, it was natural for the latter to feel extremely pressured. Keyes had only dared to attack the camel god by forcing himself to focus. However, as the camel god devoured the divine power, the suppression brought about by the difference in status was significantly reduced. As the divine power in his body decreased, the camel god gradually fell into a weaker state. As the camel god grew weaker, not only was he unable to fight back, but his ability to think had also deteriorated. Roar! Keyes' eyes were burning with flames as he swallowed the last piece of the god's flesh into his stomach. A large amount of information suddenly appeared in the young blue dragon's mind. All sorts of secrets about the camel empire in the island world, the camel god's past, and the secrets of the god's authority that the camel god had comprehended. All of these surfaced on the surface of the sulcus in his cerebral cortex. In a sense, this could be considered the camel god's final counterattack. If Keyes forgot himself while he was receiving the massive amount of information, then the information would create a new camel god. However, at the last moment when the young blue dragon's brain was about to shut down, he suddenly had an epiphany. His psychic ability was fully activated, and he created the first spirit crystal servant that he had made himself. At the same time, all the statues, totems, and other idolatrous items related to the camel god in the island world shattered at once. Chapter 247. A tower castle called the Dragon's Nest Outpost rose from the ground and was hidden in the newly emerged hills in the center of the large oasis. It was surrounded by a tall wall, and the houses in the wall were simple but functional. Now, the mountain where the Twin Peaks Temple was located was dead silent, and the mountain was devastated. Since the fall of the camel god, vines and weeds had grown wildly due to the nourishment of his divine blood, and the once lush old trees had not regained their vitality. From afar, the withered and bleak hills were like withered skeletons, making people shudder. But what frightened the camel people the most was the army of the dragon clan that occupied this place. Originally, most of the elemental shamans, priests, and their emperor in the camel empire were all wiped out by the god's cane that fell from the sky, leaving only a few Twin Peaks nobles who survived. Due to the lack of organization and management, these scattered resistance forces were no match for the Dragon Clan warriors who were armed to the teeth. In just half a month, the entire Camel Empire was declared to have fallen. In order to make up for the lack of military strength, the Desert Kobold tribe used a secret method to forcibly ripen a batch of hatchlings that had just hatched from eggs at the cost of a small part of their life force to fill the ranks of the army that conquered the island world. Every time they came to Jamek, they would conquer one. Every time they passed by a farm, they would occupy a farm. They were invincible and invincible. But with a large number of camel people surrendering, how to settle them became another problem. If these places were still managed by the surrendered Twin Peaks nobles, or if they were allowed to remain in a disorderly state, there would undoubtedly be security risks, which would affect the scales of Eternal Order Chamber of Commerce's ability to seize profits. If they adopted the strategy of exterminating the camel people and using the Dragon Clan of the Ash World to colonize this place, it might arouse the hostility of the Polar Bear People Federation, which would cause unnecessary friction in the short term. Secondly, even with the secret method of ripening, it would be difficult for the population of the Dragon Clan to reach the size of the original Camel Empire, which would also affect the business of the scales of Eternal Order. After repeated deliberations, Keyes decided to introduce a large number of floating raft people to land and live there to reduce the proportion of the camel people in this area. At the same time, he also established the Dragon Nest Sentry Post system to include the entire camel people empire. As for the hunchbacks who were resistant, the young blue dragon directly let the Dragonborn clan use force to coerce them into building roads between the Dragon Nest outposts that were being built in order to waste their energy that had nowhere to go. For several months, all the camel people were cut off from dancing, feasting, laughing, and other activities. In addition to eating, drinking, going to the toilet, and completing their daily work, they also needed to drive the broken-hoofed ox carts filled with cyan stones to deliver the materials to their compatriots who were serving the corvée. The ones in charge of supervising them were mainly the desert kobolds and the battle lizardmen. If there were not enough manpower or the place where the road was paved was too remote, some young Blue Dragon subordinates to Keys would take over the supervision duties of the Dragon Clan warriors. The two brothers, Shorttail Melis and Irontail Gorgias, and their common partner, Anidos, were all part of these senior supervisors, and they had a scheduled tour of work almost every day. Flying and patrolling, checking the progress of the project, quality inspection, a series of processes were quite cumbersome. For the young Megalosaurus who had yet to settle down, this work was really boring, but they were willing to do it. Many young blue dragons who couldn't keep their work schedules full were even a little envious of these three blue dragons. This was because whenever they didn't have work to do, they would be asked by Kasla to volunteer to donate blood. Literally, their blood. The collection of dragon blood had a lot to do with one of Key's plans. With the disappearance of the Hunchback Empire, the binary class system of double peak and single peak was no longer stable. Although there was now a strong suppression by the Dragon Clan, and many hunchbacks had yet to realize this, but with the passage of time, the instability of the social structure would certainly breed chaos, and in turn affect the long-term stability of the place. As a ruler and a Penishade Megalosaurus who was on the side of order, Keys naturally needed to formulate a new system of order, and this system must be firmly in his own hands. Therefore, he wanted to create a half-dragon, or a half-dragon camel, on the island world. Indeed, in the multiverse, creatures with mixed dragon blood were not rare. In most cases, they were hybrids born of the Megalosaurus and other creatures. However, Keys did not have such plans, and to be honest, he was still a child by the standards of the Megalosaurus. Fortunately, this was a world where magic flourished, and creating a half-dragon camel could be done with magic. However, in the first experiment, the young blue dragon discovered that there seemed to be some problems with using his own blood to modify the dragon bloodline. Firstly, after devouring the camel god, he had evolved the ability to regenerate rapidly. The process of bleeding himself could not even compare to the speed of the wound healing, and each time he bled, he would have to inflict a deep self-harm. Secondly, even if Keys steeled himself to continuously extract blood from himself, his blood seemed to have something special. Perhaps it had something to do with the ability to adapt. After it was poured into the bodies of other creatures, the experimental subjects would turn into a pool of bloody tofu and die in extreme pain. Therefore, he would force his brethren in the lair to voluntarily donate blood to contribute to his research on the dragon bloodline modification spell. Of course, some of his younger brethren were slightly dissatisfied with this, but they also knew that the power of the fist was the truth. Besides, Keys did not collect much blood from them, at least in terms of the size of the target. It was true. The key step of modifying the dragon bloodline of the half-dragon camel was to soak the camel in a high concentration of dragon blood reagent. With the size of the camel, even if it was just to modify a half-dragon camel, the amount of blood required was probably enough to make a young blue dragon go into shock. Most of the dragon blood used to modify the half-dragon camel was the spoils of war that Keys seized after killing the ancient brown dragon that took over the nest. The amount of blood contributed by the young blue dragon was only about 1/3 of the total amount of dragon blood reagent needed. This was mainly for the sake of controlling the half-dragon camel. As a half-dragon creature, they maintained a natural reverence for the source of their inherited bloodline. As long as Keys could command the blue dragon, the half-dragon camel would be in the palm of his hand. When everything was ready, the first camel to be modified by the half-dragon camel was the former warlord of the camel people, Gearsan. Similar to becoming the first elemental shaman of the camel people, he became the first half-dragon camel of the camel people. As the saying goes, a wise man submits to circumstances. After the fall of the camel god, Gearsan, as the priest of the camel god, quickly accepted this fact. Not only did he not try to resist, but he actively lobbied the original double-peak nobles in the Camel Empire to accept the rule of the young blue dragon. This really surprised Keys, and he even specifically asked him about it. Your actions now are completely different from your previous insistence on fighting the demonic fish. At that time, the shaman master had just recovered from his injuries. After the fall of the camel god, the spirit's extinguishers also gave up suppressing him. He stayed obediently on the island where the floating raft people lived, living in a seaside cabin specially arranged for him. In the cabin, there was only a small bed with neat bedding. A small table was placed beside the bed, and an old oil lamp on the table was the only light source there. After listening respectfully to Keys's question, Girsan nodded. His dark brown eyes sparkled with a determination that could almost be described as fanatical. For the welfare of the camel people, he said word by word as he stared into the eyes of the young blue dragon. That's the whole meaning of my life. It has never changed, but the form has changed. I can only adapt to the new form. Needless to say, Girsan understood what this conversation meant. Keys wanted to recruit him and use his prestige among the camel people to establish a new ruling system. If the camel god had not fallen, and the camel empire had not collapsed, even if the camel emperor was hostile to him and wanted to kill him, Girsan would still choose to support Caesar, whom all the Twin Peak nobles had sworn allegiance to, and fight against the invaders from the other planes. But now, even Caesar's body was gone, and his descendants' inheritance was cut off. Between the so-called ruling system of the Double Peak nobles and life and death of all the camel people, Girsan would undoubtedly choose the latter. Instead of letting the young blue dragon support other puppets, or simply launch genocide, he would rather bear the infamy himself to save more camel people to live and recuperate in this world. His words were concise and to the point, but they were very real, so real that Quest believed him. Of course, what really dispelled Keys's doubts was the lie detection spell cast before the conversation, proving that Girsan was indeed telling the truth. But even so, as a 5-color evil dragon, Keys would not easily trust a smart person. He still had a trick up his sleeve in the end. Didn't he claim to be for the welfare of the camel people? Then he simply transformed him into a half-dragon camel. He used the dragon bloodline transformation spell to put a shackle on Girsan. On the day of the completion of the highway system connecting the various dragon nest posts, all the Double Peak nobles who actively or passively surrendered, as well as some of the newly rising leaders among the single peak camel people, were ordered to come to the large oasis of the Camel Empire to participate in the groundbreaking ceremony. And at this ceremony, in order to commend Girsan's achievements, Keys deliberately gave him the dragon blood transformation reward in front of them. The old camel elemental shaman took off his clothes and stepped into a large cauldron carved out of a whole crystal. Then he was submerged in a dragon blood potion carried by the desert kobolds. After falling into the cauldron, the dragon blood potion quickly solidified into a blood cocoon, tightly wrapping Girsan in it. After about a third of an hourglass, the blood cocoon suddenly burst, and the first half-dragon camel appeared in the island world. Under his skin, light brown scales were faintly discernible, and the muscles all over his body were bulging. He did not look old at all. A pair of megalosaurus, like membrane wings, stretched out from his back. With a little wave, the whole person rose from the ground and hung in the air. A circle of blue scales surrounded his neck like a necklace. His cheeks became as thin as an eagle's, and he spat out a bolt of lightning when he opened his mouth. In the eyes of all the camel leaders present, there was uncontrollable envy and jealousy. Keys, who noticed this change, showed an imperceptible smile at the corner of his mouth. After the double peak camel people and single peak camel people, there was a new class among the camel people. Chapter 248. Bite was the capital of the May Empire. The whole city was built in the shape of a wheel, and the center of the wheel was actually the hub of the whole city. All the major public institutions and Pharaoh's palace were there, and the magnificent stairs and elegant pillars competed with each other. From the small circle in the center, there were wide roads paved with carefully trimmed stones extending in all directions, and on both sides were tall trees full of green all year round. These roads led to the 7 gates of the city wall and the harbor in the north. It was the Opat festival, and the celebration was in full swing. All the Medic people would celebrate this festival in their respective cities, but they did not pay as much attention to it as the people living in Bite. For the festival, symbolizing the generosity of Pharaoh, the Medic people who were closer to Pharaoh naturally felt it more deeply. The gate of the palace was opened, and the attendants took out a large amount of lager beer, pre-baked white bread, spade-tooth venison simmered with cheese, roasted pork breasts sprinkled with expensive spices from the Pharaoh's private storehouse, and sent them to all the Bite people who were willing to pay tribute to the Pharaoh. In addition to free food, more entertainment also appeared in the streets and alleys of Bite. Hawkers piled a dazzling array of goods on colorful stalls. Gullible people wasted money on games of chance. Dancing bears wandered around the streets, and illusionists attracted the admiration and attention of the old and young. It's really lively here. Coming out of the terminal, Keys in human form walked beside the big-bellied general, who was his guide on this trip to Bite. This atmosphere makes me very comfortable, but I don't know if it can be maintained. After conquering the Camel Empire, creating the half-dragon camel, and completing the construction of the Dragon Nest outpost system in the island world, the young blue dragon returned to the Ashes world. The follow-up work of conquering the demonic fish and trading with the Polar Bear Federation was handed over to the half-lich Snade and the 3 ogre brothers respectively. Counting the days, the bloody battle's wartime vacation was about to end. Therefore, Keys had to seize the time to stabilize his forces in Medic and convert the resources obtained from the island world into part of his own strength. With this goal in mind, the scale of perpetual order was fully activated. In just a few months, a large number of Medici's products were dumped on the island world, and a large number of precious metals such as gold and silver flowed back to the Ash world. Silver was a strategic material. Keys had used the Silver Bullet Offensive against the Tana-Wreath demons and achieved good results, so all the silver brought back from the island world was kept for his own use. As such, gold became the general currency used by the scale of perpetual order to pay for interplanar trade and purchase the materials needed to create the behemoth. The merchants all expressed their approval and even flocked to him like a flock of ducks. There had never been so much gold pouring into the Ashes world. Fortunately, according to the merchants' habits, most of the gold was hidden away as treasures and did not flow into the market. Otherwise, Medica's relatively weak trading system might be broken. The Medic officials were the first to learn that Megalosaurus Pasha used gold to trade, and it was the sniffer unit belonging to the Grandvader. In a sense, they could be said to be pervasive, especially in the Medici Empire. Not even the slightest movement could escape their sharp eyes and ears. However, although the sniffer unit knew that Megalosaurus Pasha had a lot of gold, and even the flow of the gold was clearly investigated by them, the source was still different. In order to monopolize the interests of the island world, Keys only used the power of the dragon's lair when conquering and occupying it, and did not use a single soldier under the title of Pasha. Regarding the truth of this secret, the merchants who had dealt with the scale of perpetual order had 2 guesses. One was that Megalosaurus Pasha used the wealth accumulated by the dragon's lair from ancient times, and the other was that Keys might have found a gold mine. Some of the more quick-witted ones even took out some gold to seek out divination spells, hoping to find out more about it. However, Keys had long been prepared. He had smelted the original camel gold coins in the island world and turned them into small gold bricks to pay the merchants of Medic. Without the original shape of the gold coins, any divination about the origin of the gold bricks would not be effective. At most, it could be found that when Megalosaurus smelted the gold, in order to increase its hardness, it had infiltrated a small amount of brass into it. Gold mixed with brass was still a hard currency and had an extremely high value. In fact, most of the merchants' curiosity stopped there. After all, they did not need to take the risk of angering Megalosaurus Pasha just to satisfy their own curiosity. However, some people, No one knew whether it was intentional or not, but the Obsidian Council in Bite City learned that the noble mages of Medic had a completely different idea from the merchants. Gold was one of the universal equivalents between planes, and its importance to mages was self-evident. Gold had always been extremely scarce in the Ash world, and the gold mines of Medic that had been discovered had been exhausted hundreds of years ago. All the documents that had been kept in secret showed that there was no gold mine in the dragon's lair. Moreover, there was no precedent of gold being stored in the ancient books about the Blue Dragon clan. Then, for quests to be able to use gold as payment, he must have found a gold mine in the Pasha territory of the Medici Empire that he had recently taken control of. It must have been a gold mine that had not yet been discovered by anyone. It must be so, the stubborn Obsidian Council firmly believed. Wealth moved people's hearts, and a gold mine that had not been mined was a fortune that no one could ignore. It should not belong to a Megalosaurus and a Pasha. Only Pharaoh of Medic, and perhaps the noble spellcasters who came from famous families, deserved such wealth. Of course, the previous few tests of the Megalosaurus Pasha and the bitter consequences they had to swallow were enough for the Obsidian Council to recognize Key's strength and means. Therefore, they chose to attack from other angles, better and safer to destroy Key's advantage. Pharaoh's authority was a good way to cut in. As a Pasha of Medic, they had to spend the week after Opat every year in Bite. They needed to come here to report to Pharaoh and pay the taxes of the territory under their jurisdiction. Originally, due to the invasion of the Wusong Empire, the cities under Key's rule, such as Nome and Spat, would have a 2-year tax reduction. However, because of the recent business scale of the Scale of Perpetual Order, not only was this discount canceled, but the tax quota was also increased by 20%. Therefore, the young Blue Dragon had to follow tradition and come to Bite to complain to Pharaoh about his difficulties. As soon as he stepped off the floating airship made of Leviathan's derivative, the big-bellied general of Medic, who was familiar with him, came to greet him. That was why he said those words. After hearing this, the big-bellied general could not help but wipe the sweat dripping from his forehead. He waved his hand to let the guards stand a little further away, looked around, and said, "Pasha, please pardon me. Your Excellency Pasha, please understand me. I'm only here to receive you under the Pharaoh's orders. This doesn't mean that I'm in cahoots with those people. In fact, I don't think their plan will succeed. After all," he chose his words carefully, "all along, Lord Grand Vader has been your loyal ally. That you're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.